If you lived in Victorian Britain, chances are your sweet tooth would have been less of a tooth and more of a full set of jaws. Sugar wasn't just a treat, it was the glittering star of the Victorian diet, the white powder that fueled a nation of industrial workers, dreamy children and social climbers trying to look a little fancier at tea time. Forget kale smoothies or oat milk lattes. Victorian indulgence came in the form of boiled sweets, humbugs, toffees, and luridly coloured drops that practically shouted from the shop window, "Eat me, I'm fun." And yes, they were fun, until they weren't. Because here's the catch. Candy in the Victorian era was a delicious game of roulette. You either satisfied your craving or made a quick acquaintance with your local undertaker. Hello, travellers. Histories do not always need to be boring. You can rest here and listen to hilarious histories to drift off to sleep. Before we continue, leave a comment to let me know when and where you are listening to this, and hit the subscribe button, but only if you enjoy what I do here. Let's begin. To understand how candy became both obsession and menace, you need to know how it slipped into daily life. For centuries, sugar had been a luxury good, something reserved for the rich who could afford to sprinkle it on their meat, because nothing says wealth like sweetened beef. But by the mid-19th century, the global sugar trade, fueled by the brutal realities of Caribbean plantations, had dumped mountains of the sweet stuff into Britain. For the first time, sugar wasn't reserved for aristocrats in their gilded dining halls. Ordinary families could afford it, and they couldn't get enough. Walk down a bustling Victorian street in London, Manchester, or Bradford, and you'd be surrounded by shop windows crammed with sticky, glistening temptations. Confectioners had figured out how to boil sugar into hard candy, whip it into brittle, or stretch it into glossy ribbons that made children squeal with delight. Penny sweets became the ultimate affordable pleasure, small luxury for the working class who couldn't afford much else. The craving was universal. Children devoured them, adults sneaked them between shifts, and even grannies kept humbugs in their aprons. Sugar was both reward and escape, the edible equivalent of Victorian Netflix. But why candy specifically? Well, the Victorians were obsessed with novelty, and candy was endlessly adaptable. You could make it in dazzling colors, sculpt it into shapes, add exotic flavors, or even give it festive names. It was the toy of the palate. The Victorians didn't just want to eat, they wanted to marvel at what was possible. A plain boiled sweet was one thing, but a bright green lozenge? That was magic, or at least it looked like it. Spoiler, that green wasn't from spinach juice, it was arsenic. Oops. The craze also tied neatly into the rhythms of Victorian urban life. For factory workers, cheap candy provided bursts of quick energy in a world that demanded grueling hours. For children, it was both a treat and a bribe. Parents knew a stick of candy could buy 5 minutes of quiet, which in a house full of 12 kids was priceless. For the rising middle class, fancy imported chocolates and sugared almonds became a status symbol at dinner parties, as essential to showing off as fine china or your latest questionable mustache style. The business of candy flourished. Confectioners didn't need Michelin stars or culinary training, just sugar, a pot, and enough charm to lure customers inside. And lure they did. Shops painted signs with bold promises of sweetness, stalls overflowed in marketplaces, and even traveling peddlers carried satchels of candy to sell on the go. One contemporary observer noted that candy seemed to follow children like a shadow. It was everywhere, cheap and irresistible. Candy was the one corner of the consumer world where class lines blurred. Whether you were a banker's son or a factory girl, you could share the same sticky handful of peppermints. Of course, this rapid expansion also created the perfect storm. With demand skyrocketing, supply had to keep up, and not every confectioner was honest or skilled. But we'll get to that scandal later. For now, imagine yourself standing in a Victorian candy shop, surrounded by glass jars glittering like treasure chests, each filled with hard candies that look too pretty to resist. The air is thick with the scent of caramelizing sugar. Children are pressing their noses against the glass, and the shopkeeper smiles as if he's selling joy itself. This was the wonderland Victorians stepped into daily. Yet behind the sparkle lurked a darker truth. Unlike today, where food is regulated and your soda doesn't contain wallpaper paste, hopefully. Victorians lived in a world where almost anything could slip into your food, and candy, with its bright colors and innocent marketing, was the perfect cover for some of the nastiest additives known to man. But in the beginning, nobody thought about that. Nobody wanted to, because sugar had enchanted them. The appeal of candy was more than just taste. It was psychological. In an era defined by hardship, soot-stained cities, back-breaking labor, and constant disease, candy was the cheapest form of happiness. A child who couldn't dream of new toys could still dream of a sticky toffee. A worker who couldn't afford a night at the theater could still afford a peppermint humbug. Candy wasn't just food, it was a coping mechanism, and that is why the stage was set for disaster. When candy became the everyday miracle of Victorian life, it also became the perfect Trojan horse. People trusted it, adored it, and devoured it, never suspecting that their beloved sweets might be double agents for death. So yes, sugar was the TikTok of the Victorian era. Everyone was addicted, and it rotted more than just your teeth. It rotted society's ability to tell the difference between a treat and a toxin. And as we move forward, you'll see just how spectacularly that sweet obsession backfired. Picture this. The year is 1850. Chimneys are coughing smoke into the sky. Trains are rattling across the countryside. And somewhere in the middle of it all, a man with a pot of boiling sugar is about to change your afternoon snack forever. Industrialization wasn't just about steam engines and iron bridges. It was also about turning humble treats into a booming business. Enter the Victorian confectioner, the Willy Wonkas of their age, minus the Oompa Loompas and plus a suspiciously unwashed apron. Before the factories, candy was mostly handmade in small batches by skilled confectioners. It was slow work, sugar needed boiling, pulling, and shaping, and every sweet had to be individually handled. It was more art than industry, and that meant candy was expensive. You didn't just stroll into a shop and buy a bag of peppermints for pennies. You saved up the way you might save for a new coat. Candy was occasional indulgence, not everyday habit. But then came the Victorian industrial boom, and suddenly sugar processing scaled up like never before. New machinery made it possible to refine sugar faster, cheaper, and in massive quantities. Steam-powered engines and mechanized rollers could churn out sweets by the barrel load. What once took hours of labor by a trained hand could now be spat out in endless ribbons of glossy taffy. Candy went from artisanal luxury to industrial product in less than a generation. This industrial shift did something important. It democratized candy. It wasn't just the wealthy nibbling sugared almonds anymore. The working classes could buy bright boiled sweets for a penny. The phrase penny candy wasn't just a marketing trick, it was a revolution. For the first time, families who lived hand to mouth could still afford to let their children leave a shop with sticky hands and happy grins. In a society riddled with inequality, candy shops were one of the few places where rich and poor could experience the same sugary thrill. Though, as we'll see later, the risks were not equally distributed. And oh, the candy shops, they sprouted in towns and cities like mushrooms after rain. Every bustling street seemed to have at least one, with tall glass jars lined up like jeweled soldiers, filled with lozenges, humbugs, licorice sticks, and boiled sweets in every shade of the rainbow. For children, these shops were temples of temptation. Press your nose against the glass, and you could see a universe of sugar waiting just out of reach. For adults, they were quick escapes from the grind of factory life, offering a cheap way to indulge in something frivolous. The confectioners themselves became a distinct class of tradesmen. Some were shopkeepers who made their own sweets in the back room, stirring copper pans over open flames and pouring molten sugar onto marble slabs to cool. Others were wholesalers, buying factory-made sweets in bulk and selling them to local vendors. Many were opportunists who had no background in food making but realized that sugar plus boiling pot, money. Training was optional, enthusiasm was plenty, and business was brisk. Candy also fit perfectly into the Victorian obsession with novelty. The industrial process allowed experimentation. Different molds, colors, and flavors could be produced quickly, giving consumers endless variety. You could buy striped sticks, tiny lozenges, pastel drops, or massive jawbreakers that threatened to loosen your molars. The Victorians loved anything new, bright, or theatrical, and confectioners supplied it in spades. Some even shaped candies into miniature fruits or animals, so your child could gnaw on something that looked like a pear but tasted like concentrated sugar. It was whimsy, edible, and cheap. Of course, competition was fierce. With so many shops springing up, confectioners had to fight for attention. Shop windows became battlegrounds of display. One vendor might boast a mountain of lemon drops, while another stacked toffees in pyramids tall enough to collapse dramatically if bumped. The more eye-catching the presentation, the more likely customers were to wander in. Children were targeted directly. Brightly painted signs, playful shapes, and penny deals all screamed, "Spend your allowance here." Parents might grumble, but even they were seduced. This candy boom also tied neatly into the rhythm of Victorian leisure culture. Sweet shops weren't just for purchases, they were social spaces. Couples strolled in for after-dinner mints. Children begged to be taken there after Sunday church, and workers stopped by on payday to treat themselves. Buying sweets wasn't just an errand, it was a small ceremony of delight. But beneath all this sugary prosperity lurked an issue. Quantity came at the expense of quality. Industrial candy was cheap, but it wasn't always carefully made. The same machinery that churned out endless batches also encouraged shortcuts. Many confectioners prioritized speed and cost-cutting over safety or taste. And with little regulation, there was nothing stopping a vendor from tossing in fillers, dyes, or questionable ingredients to stretch a profit. Still, in these early years, nobody was thinking about arsenic-green lozenges or plaster-filled peppermints. What mattered was that candy had become a fixture of Victorian life. It wasn't going anywhere, and the confectioners were riding a wave of sugar-fueled demand that showed no signs of slowing. So yes, candy shops popped up faster than today's coffee chains, except back then your frappuccino didn't kill you, the toffee might. The rise of the Victorian confectioners was a triumph of industry, novelty and commerce, wrapped up in cellophane-coloured dreams. It was sweet, it was exciting, and it was dangerously unexamined. For all the sweetness flooding Victorian Britain, there was still one bitter truth. Sugar wasn't exactly cheap. Yes, industrialization had brought mountains of the stuff into cities, but it remained expensive enough that confectioners were always on the lookout for ways to stretch their supply. And when Victorian entrepreneurs wanted to cut costs, they didn't invent light or sugar-free versions. No, they reached for something more sinister, additives that were cheaper, easier to obtain, and often best suited for making bricks rather than bonbons. The Victorian candy trade was a world where profit margins mattered more than flavor or survival. If sugar prices spiked, your local confectioner might quietly slip in a little extra something to make up the difference. And by something, I mean chalk dust, plaster of Paris, or powdered stone. If you ever wondered what licking a wall in a condemned house might taste like, Victorian penny candy had the answer. Why these bizarre substitutes? Because they were dirt cheap. Sometimes literally dirt. Chalk, for instance, could mimic the look of fine sugar when ground down. Brick dust added bulk, and even gave a pleasant pink tint to some sweets. Pleasant, that is, until you realized you were eating what used to be part of a chimney. And plaster? Well, it was soft enough to dissolve, hard enough to bulk out your product, and didn't cost a fraction of sugar. Never mind that your stomach wasn't a construction site. But fillers weren't the only trick in the bag. Sugar needed to be boiled to create hard candies, which required expensive fuel. Some confectioners eager to save pennies used shortcuts that left their sweets gritty, smoky, or suspiciously flavored. Others relied on adulterated flour or starches to pad out their batches, a culinary equivalent of cutting vodka with tap water. The result? Candy that was technically edible but about as nourishing as a handful of gravel. And then there were the dyes. Oh, the dyes. Victorians adored colour, and confectioners knew bright hues drew children like moths to a flame. The problem was, natural dyes were expensive and hard to source. So instead, shopkeepers dipped into the chemical cabinet. Lead chromate made a brilliant yellow. Copper compounds created striking blue-greens, and arsenic-based pigments gave you that vivid, irresistible shade of green that seemed too good to be true because it was. The end result was a sweet that looked like a jewel but worked more like a time bomb. Think of it like the first version of diet soda, except instead of less sugar you got a side of arsenic. What's remarkable is how normal this practice became. Food adulteration wasn't seen as a shocking betrayal. It was business. Flour was cut with alum, beer with sawdust, milk with chalk. Candy was simply following the trend. The difference was that candy was marketed to the most vulnerable children. Adults might have toughened stomachs and hardened skepticism, but children gobbled sweets with blind trust. And when that sweet was laced with plaster, the results could be devastating. Some confectioners weren't outright villains. They just didn't know better. Chemistry was a mysterious frontier in the 19th century, and many shopkeepers had little education. If a salesman swore that a certain powder made your candies more colorful or lasted longer, you might take him at his word. Others, of course, knew exactly what they were doing but figured the risk was worth the profit. After all, who would ever trace a child's sudden stomach pains back to a peppermint humbug? There's also the cultural element. The Victorian economy thrived on a laissez-faire philosophy. Let the market do what it will. Regulation was minimal, and the public was accustomed to food not always being what it seemed. People half expected their flour to be stretched, their beer to be weak, and their sweets to be suspicious. As long as no scandal broke out, the system trundled on. Imagine being a child with a penny in your pocket, staring at a jar of gleaming lozenges. You don't know that half the jar is sugar and half is ground-up brick. You don't know that the beautiful green drop you're about to pop into your mouth was dyed with a substance better suited for rat poison. You just know it tastes sweet, and for 5 glorious minutes the world is better, until of course your stomach starts to argue otherwise. The sad reality is that most families couldn't afford to be picky. Candy was cheap joy, and cheap joy always came with hidden costs. Even when rumors swirled about bad batches, most people shrugged and bought another humbug. For the poor, avoiding adulterated food entirely was nearly impossible. Bread, milk, meat, and yes, sweets, all were vulnerable to tampering. In that sense, candy was just one more hazard in a daily life already full of them, and so the cycle continued. Expensive sugar, cheap fillers, dazzling dyes, and unsuspecting customers. Victorian confectioners may not have been rubbing their hands together like cartoon villains, but the outcome was the same. Candy was a gamble, and every sweet could be a loaded pistol wrapped in cellophane-colored dreams. This was the darker side of the candy craze, the relentless drive to stretch profit margins by any means necessary, no matter how unappetizing or deadly the results. And as we'll see, it wasn't long before those cost-cutting measures began to leave a very visible and very tragic trail. If the Victorians had an aesthetic, it was make it bright, make it bold, and worry about the consequences later. They adored vivid colors in everything. Wallpapers, dresses, carpets, even their candy. And no color embodied this obsession more than a dazzling shade of green, known variously as Scheele's green or emerald green. It wasn't just a color, it was a cultural phenomenon. It shimmered like spring grass. It glowed like jewel tones in a stained glass window. And it also happened to contain a generous helping of arsenic. Minor detail. This color was invented back in the 1770s by a Swedish chemist named Carl Wilhelm Scheele, who had no idea he was about to make Victorian life both prettier and shorter. By combining copper salts with arsenic, he produced a pigment so vivid and durable that it outshone every natural dye on the market. Artists, decorators, and fashion designers fell in love instantly. Finally, here was a green that didn't fade into muddy brown after a few weeks. Finally, a green that looked alive. The only problem was, it also kept you from staying alive. The dangers became apparent early on. People who worked with the pigment painters, wallpaper manufacturers, and textile dyers often developed sores, respiratory issues, and other ominous symptoms. Some even died. Yet the demand for Scheele's green only grew. By the time the Victorian era rolled around, Britain was drenched in arsenic green. Drawing rooms were wallpapered with it, gowns were dyed with it, and artificial flowers were dusted in its powdered form to look fresh forever. Even children's toys sometimes bore the deadly shade. The Victorians, to put it bluntly, were living in a glowing green death trap. So how did this fashionable hue creep into sweets? The answer is as simple as it is horrifying: the love of spectacle. Confectioners wanted their candy to look as dazzling as the dresses and drapes in high society. A pale mint drop was boring, a radiant emerald lozenge was irresistible, and while there were other dyes available, none offered the same eye-popping brilliance as arsenic green. You could spot it from across the street. It looked fresh, it looked luxurious, and it looked like the kind of candy that whispered, "Eat me, I dare you." The use of Scheele's green in candy wasn't limited to high-end shops either. Street vendors and penny sweet sellers eagerly embraced it. A touch of arsenic-based pigment in your sugar batch meant customers flocked to your stall instead of your rivals. Children, with their wide eyes and love of anything shiny, were especially drawn to these emerald sweets. Imagine a Victorian child proudly holding up a glistening green lozenge like a treasure coin, completely unaware that their treat was loaded with one of nature's deadliest poisons. And this wasn't some obscure urban legend. Contemporary reports regularly described cases of illness, traced back to vividly colored candies. Victims complained of stomach cramps, vomiting, and weakness, classic signs of arsenic poisoning. The unlucky ones didn't recover. Yet because the pigment was so cheap, easy to obtain, and wildly popular, confectioners kept using it. The public was dazzled by color, and shopkeepers couldn't resist giving them what they wanted. It's worth pausing to consider the irony. Arsenic green was marketed as the color of life. In fashion, it symbolized freshness and vitality. In interiors, it made rooms feel bright and modern. In candy, it suggested zest and excitement. Yet behind this shimmering facade, the pigment was quietly stealing lives. You could die from licking your wallpaper, brushing against your dress, or sucking on a peppermint drop. Victorian society in many ways had poisoned itself with its own vanity. The authorities knew something was wrong, but regulation lagged behind reality. Even after repeated poisonings, there was little action. Part of the issue was denial. Who wanted to believe their stylish drawing room or their child's candy was a hazard? The other issue was profit. Manufacturers made money off Scheele's green and customers kept buying it. It was a deadly stalemate between commerce and caution, with consumers caught in the middle. Newspapers occasionally ran sensational stories, warning readers about poison candies or death in wallpaper. But for every article that stirred public concern, there were hundreds of shop windows still glittering with arsenic-tinted sweets. Much like modern debates over unhealthy fast food or chemical additives, the Victorian sweet tooth proved stronger than caution. So yes, arsenic green became the darling of Victorian confectioners. It was the shade of envy, elegance, and oh yes, your funeral bouquet. Few things summed up the contradictions of the age so perfectly. A society that demanded beauty and progress, even if it meant choking on its own achievements. And candy was only the beginning. In the next chapter, we'll explore the equally bizarre but less glamorous additives, chalk, plaster, and brick dust that padded out sweets for profit. If arsenic green was the glamorous celebrity of Victorian adulteration, these humble fillers were the unsung, gritty backup dancers. If you've ever wondered what childhood tasted like in Victorian Britain, the answer might be a cross between sugar, despair, and a mouthful of someone's demolished chimney. By the mid-19th century, penny candy wasn't just sweetened with sugar, it was often fortified with an unlikely list of building materials. Why settle for calcium in milk when you could crunch on plaster in your peppermint? The logic behind it was brutally simple. Sugar was still the most expensive ingredient in the confectioner's toolkit. Every ounce shaved off the recipe meant more profit in the till. But you couldn't just hand children half-sized humbugs or watered-down toffee. People expected bulk, weight, and a satisfying crunch. The solution? Swap out expensive sugar for cheap, powdery substances that happened to look a lot like it. And what better source than the materials used to patch your walls? Chalk was a favorite. Ground finely, It could pass for sugar well enough, at least until it landed on your tongue. It gave candies a strange powdery texture, as if your peppermint had been filtered through a classroom blackboard. And let's not forget the health effects. While chalk isn't as deadly as arsenic, it was hardly digestible in large amounts. Children who chewed their way through chalk-laced sweets might end up with stomach cramps, constipation, or worse. Still, to a penny-pinching confectioner, chalk was perfect. It was cheap, plentiful, and didn't immediately scream "you've been poisoned." Then came plaster of Paris, a substance normally reserved for sculptures, ceilings, or casts for broken bones. Confectioners discovered it made an excellent filler for lozenges. Why waste sugar when you could bulk up a batch with plaster dust? Sure, it gave candy a strange chalky hardness, but customers often mistook that for lasting longer in the mouth. In reality, it was your digestive system that had to last longer under assault. Plaster candy was essentially edible drywall, except edible is being generous. And then perhaps the most notorious, brick dust. Imagine grinding down a wall and mixing it with sugar syrup. Voila, you've got yourself a batch of rosy lozenges ready for market. Brick dust had two advantages for unscrupulous sellers. It was dirt cheap, and it added a reddish tint that customers mistook for fruity flavoring. A candy that looked like strawberry but tasted like gravel? That's Victorian innovation for you. Of course, brick dust also carried the risk of silica and other irritants, which could shred your insides faster than a Victorian sawmill. But hey, at least it looked festive. The worst part? These fillers weren't even considered scandalous in the same way arsenic was. Arsenic grabbed headlines because it killed quickly and dramatically. But chalk, plaster, and brick dust? They were the everyday cheats. They weakened bodies, caused chronic stomach complaints, and stunted children's growth, but slowly, silently. For the working poor who already lived in cramped, unsanitary conditions, a candy diet sprinkled with building rubble was just another insult layered onto survival. Confectioners often brushed off criticism with the excuse of ignorance. "Oh, I didn't realize a little brick dust could be harmful," they'd claim, as though feeding children the remnants of a construction site was somehow reasonable. Others argued it was harmless because people ate bread stretched with alum or drank beer watered down with dubious ingredients. In a way, they weren't wrong. Victorian diets were riddled with adulteration across the board. Candy simply carried it to colorful extremes. There's also the psychological trick at play. For many customers, the experience of candy was visual before it was gustatory. A humbug looked like a humbug whether it contained sugar or chalk. A peppermint lozenge gleamed enticingly in the jar whether it had plaster mixed in or not. By the time the unpleasant aftertaste or gritty texture revealed the fraud, it was too late. The penny had already changed hands. And for children, who lacked the palate and the cynicism to tell the difference, candy was candy, even if it doubled as a home repair kit. Reports from the time occasionally documented the sheer range of fillers used. Analysts found lozenges that crumbled under pressure, sweets that sparked against teeth, and drops that seemed more mineral than edible. One chemist quipped that some candies could probably be ground back into bricks and used to repair the very streets where they were sold. And considering the state of Victorian sanitation, those streets probably needed the help. Humour aside, the impact was devastating. Children were the primary victims, their smaller bodies less able to handle the onslaught of indigestible fillers. Many developed chronic stomach disorders that doctors struggled to diagnose, and because these ingredients weren't acutely poisonous like arsenic, they often went unlinked to candy altogether. Parents blamed weak constitutions, bad air, or even curses, while the real culprit was the peppermint from the corner shop. Yet, despite the dangers, the demand for cheap candy only grew. Poverty left families with little choice. A penny sweet might not be wholesome, but it was one of the few luxuries a working-class child could afford. Better to risk plaster in your toffee than go without entirely. In that grim equation, chalk and brick dust became part of the price of joy. So yes, Victorian candy wasn't just about sugar. It was about sugar plus a handful of the nearest construction debris. It was the era when your sweets doubled as a geology lesson. Why settle for calcium in milk when you could crunch on plaster in your peppermint? In modern times, a food scientist conjures images of lab coats, sterile equipment and careful measurements. In Victorian Britain, the same role was filled by a shopkeeper with an apron crusted in sugar, a second-hand pot, and about as much formal training as a cat with a whisk. These were the confectioners of the industrial age, and while some had genuine skill, far too many treated candy-making like a chaotic science experiment. They had all the precision of a toddler with finger paints, only now the finger paints were in your jawbreaker. The problem was partly one of opportunity. Candy-making didn't require years of apprenticeship, expensive tools, or even much literacy. Anyone with access to sugar, a fire, and a willingness to stir molten syrup could set up shop. That meant the candy market exploded with new entrepreneurs, grocers, bakers, street hawkers, who saw sweets as easy money. But easy money also meant easy shortcuts. And without formal recipes or scientific understanding, many simply improvised. Improvisation, in this case, meant guessing how much coloring to add, how long to boil sugar, or which powders probably wouldn't kill anyone. Spoiler, they often guessed wrong. Too little boiling left candies sticky and prone to fermenting. Too much, and they hardened into tooth-breaking lumps. Dyes were measured with a pinch here, scoop there attitude, resulting in some batches that were dull and others that could glow in the dark. One confectioner might add copper sulfate for a brilliant blue, while another thought lead oxide made for a sunnier yellow. They weren't thinking chemistry, they were thinking sales, and because many of these shopkeepers had zero awareness of toxicology, the line between edible and hazardous was blurred to the point of invisibility. In an era before standardized ingredient lists, customers had no idea what they were swallowing. A lozenge might contain peppermint oil, or it might contain whatever the shopkeeper had lying around in a mislabeled jar. If a child keeled over after eating a handful, it wasn't always clear whether the problem was the humbug or last night's stew. That ambiguity gave confectioners plenty of cover for their reckless dabbling. What's more, candy making often took place in cramped, unsanitary backrooms. Picture a small shop where the front is lined with jars of brightly colored sweets, while behind the counter sits a smoky little space filled with boiling pots. No ventilation, no hygiene standards, and often no separation between candy making and other tasks. Flour sacks, coal dust, and chemicals might all share the same shelves. A scoop of arsenic powder intended for killing rats could accidentally end up stirred into a sugar solution. And in some cases, it wasn't an accident, it was a cost-saving trick. Some confectioners actively sought out chemicals because they gave candy desirable qualities. Alum, for example, could make sweets appear whiter and more pristine. Sulfates added vivid colors. Starches and gums altered texture. But without training, shopkeepers had no idea how much was safe or even if it was remotely edible. It was food chemistry by way of chaotic guesswork. Even worse, many of these so-called candy chemists relied on hearsay or folk knowledge. Recipes were shared word of mouth, often with instructions like add enough powder until it looks right, or stir until it feels done. A candy maker might hear that a certain green dye made wallpaper pop and think, why not add it to mints? Another might be told that plaster keeps lozenges firm and decide, excellent, let's double the dose. Trial and error was the guiding principle, and unfortunately the errors tended to end up in children's stomachs. There were cases where this amateur science bordered on the absurd. Reports describe batches of candy so heavily laced with copper salts that they turned tongues blue, or lozenges so rock-hard that they cracked teeth. One infamous case involved peppermint lozenges that contained so much arsenic-based powder they caused mass poisoning, with victims vomiting almost immediately after consumption. The scientist responsible had apparently mistaken the poison for a harmless filler. His defense? He hadn't meant to kill anyone. Comforting, right? What makes it more shocking is how accepted this was in Victorian culture. People expected grocers and sweet makers to double as chemists, even though their laboratories looked more like broom closets. Customers trusted their local shopkeepers to supply safe sweets, and the shopkeepers in turn trusted their own intuition and whatever chemicals the traveling salesman had in his case. That salesman, by the way, often had no training either, just a pitch about how his powders made candy brighter, firmer, or cheaper. It was a pyramid scheme of ignorance. The cumulative effect was staggering. Every brightly colored lozenge represented not just sugar and flavoring, but also a cocktail of unknowns mixed by someone whose scientific credentials began and ended with the phrase, "Well, it worked last time." And while not every batch was deadly, the sheer inconsistency meant that buying candy was like spinning a roulette wheel. You might get a perfectly fine peppermint, or one laced with enough toxins to knock you flat. So when we call these Victorian confectioners candy chemists, it's not a compliment. They weren't pioneering edible art. They were playing mad scientist in their back rooms, armed with little more than sugar, guesswork, and dangerous powders. They had all the precision of a toddler with finger paints, only now the finger paints were in your jawbreaker. And while some customers walked away with sticky smiles, others walked away with stomach cramps, blue tongues, or worse. The sweet shop may have looked like a wonderland from the outside, but behind the counter, it was more like a chemistry set gone rogue. And as the century wore on, the tragic results of this amateur experimentation would become harder and harder to ignore. When we talk about the poison candy craze, it can sound like a grim exaggeration, the sort of spooky tale parents tell children to stop them from eating too many sweets. But the chilling reality is that candy poisonings in Victorian Britain weren't rare mishaps. They were recurring events, often involving entire towns. Nothing says festive like 200 people at a fair and half of them suddenly auditioning for ghosts. Candy, after all, wasn't eaten in polite moderation. It was a social treat, a shared indulgence, and it appeared everywhere people gathered. Markets, fairs, and holiday celebrations brimmed with vendors peddling brightly colored lozenges and sugar drops by the handful. Families would buy in bulk, children stuffed their pockets, and adults treated themselves in between rides on merry-go-rounds or exhibitions of the latest industrial wonders. But in an age when regulation barely existed, a single contaminated batch could transform a joyful event into a scene of mass suffering. Take, for example, the numerous incidents where sweets laced with arsenic or copper compounds caused waves of illness at local fairs. In one reported case, dozens of people were hospitalized after buying green lozenges that had been enhanced with a pigment more suitable for paint than for peppermint. The symptoms appeared within hours: stomach cramps, vomiting, dizziness. Some unlucky buyers didn't survive the night. Instead of going home with sticky fingers and happy memories, families carried loved ones to doctors, or in some cases to undertakers. And it wasn't always deliberate malice. Sometimes it was sheer negligence, the byproduct of sloppy preparation in backroom labs where ingredients were poorly labeled and hygiene was non-existent. Confectioners often stored sugar, side by side with other powders, chalk, alum, plaster, even arsenic meant for pest control. One mix-up could turn a normal day's candy production into a city-wide poisoning event. Because candy was cheap, batches were huge, meaning the ripple effect was immediate and catastrophic. The press loved these stories. Victorian newspapers thrived on sensationalism, and poisoned candy was the perfect scandal. Headlines screamed of murder in the marketplace or death by lozenge, drawing readers in with grisly detail. Articles often listed every symptom of the victims, practically turning public health disasters into serialized horror stories. The public devoured these accounts almost as eagerly as they devoured the sweets themselves, half scandalized and half fascinated. What made these outbreaks so terrifying was their indiscriminate nature. Unlike spoiled meat or tainted beer, which usually targeted adults, candy poisonings often struck children. Entire classrooms of students could fall sick after sharing a bag of peppermints. Neighborhoods could be gutted of their youngest residents in a single afternoon. Parents, horrified, found themselves torn between their children's pleas for sweets and their fear of letting them eat anything from the local shop. For working-class families, the tragedy was compounded. Penny candy was one of the few luxuries they could afford, yet it carried the greatest risk. One particularly notorious wave of poisonings involved candy dyed with copper sulfate, a bright blue chemical that mimicked the allure of berries. Dozens of children fell ill after consuming these berry drops, their tongues turning blue as their bodies convulsed with sickness. Witnesses described rows of children in hospital wards, their mouths stained the same shade as their poisoned candy. The detail was horrifying, but it hammered home the danger, the very qualities that made candy appealing. Its color, its novelty, were what made it lethal. The ripple effects reached beyond individual victims. When mass poisoning struck, entire communities recoiled. Markets emptied, confectioners shuttered their shops, and rumors spread like wildfire. Was it deliberate? Was someone plotting to poison the poor? Or was it sheer carelessness? The lack of clear answers fed public paranoia, and the fact that these events kept happening only deepened the dread. Yet, despite the tragedies, the sweet trade never slowed. Candy was addictive, not just physically but culturally. People loved it too much to give it up. Some parents adopted a cautious buyer beware attitude, avoiding the most lurid colors or sticking to vendors they trusted. Others simply crossed their fingers and hoped for the best. The Victorian sweet tooth was powerful, and even in the wake of death, it proved stronger than fear. These outbreaks also highlighted how ill-prepared doctors and authorities were. With limited understanding of toxicology, physicians often struggled to diagnose candy poisonings quickly. Treatments were crude: induce vomiting, administer charcoal, and pray. Coroner's inquests might trace deaths back to a batch of lozenges, but by then the damage was done. And because confectioners could claim ignorance, legal repercussions were rare. The cycle of poisoning, outrage, and forgetfulness repeated itself again and again. It's easy to imagine the scene at a Victorian fairground after such a disaster. Stalls abandoned, wrappers trampled in the mud, children crying while parents clutched their stomachs. The same candy that had promised joy turned into a communal weapon. The sweet taste that was supposed to be a cheap escape from poverty or drudgery instead left entire communities scarred. And these weren't isolated oddities. The steady drumbeat of reports made it clear. Candy wasn't just an innocent indulgence. It was a potential killer hiding in plain sight. For every family that walked away unscathed, another suffered the price of untrained confectioners playing chemist with unstable ingredients. By the mid-century, the pattern was undeniable. Poisonings weren't freak accidents, they were systemic. And nothing would make that clearer than the infamous Bradford lozenge disaster of 1858, when negligence reached its tragic peak and claimed lives on a scale so shocking that even the most laissez-faire authorities couldn't ignore it. On the evening of October 30, 1858, in the industrial town of Bradford, England, townsfolk gathered at the marketplace to indulge in one of life's simple pleasures, peppermint humbugs, sold from a popular stall by William Hardaker, nicknamed Humbug Billy. These striped lozenges were cheap, cheerful, and beloved. No one could have guessed that this batch of sweets would become the centerpiece of one of the deadliest food scandals in Victorian history. By the time the peppermint dust had settled, more than 200 people were sick, and at least 20 were dead. To understand how a sweet could wreak such havoc, you have to follow the chain of Victorian corner cutting that made disaster almost inevitable. Humbug Billy himself wasn't a candy maker. He was a vendor, a middleman who bought sweets in bulk and sold them from his stall. The humbugs he sold that day had been prepared by local confectioner Joseph Neal. Neal, like many candy makers of his time, tried to stretch his sugar supply with cheaper fillers. Powdered substances like gypsum or daft, a powdered material used to bulk out sugar, were common. Neal sent his apprentice to buy what he thought was harmless filler from a local chemist. This is where the fatal error came in. Instead of daft, the chemist's assistant handed over a container filled with arsenic trioxide, a substance so toxic that a few grains could kill. The apprentice, untrained and unaware, carried it back to Neal's workshop. Oblivious, Neal mixed it straight into his peppermint lozenges. The result? A batch of humbugs containing enough arsenic to fell an ox with every bite. That Saturday, Humbug Billy sold his stock of poisoned peppermints to unsuspecting customers. Within hours, the town was in chaos. People who had enjoyed the humbugs began collapsing with violent stomach pains, vomiting, convulsions, and paralysis. Doctors were overwhelmed as dozens, then hundreds of patients streamed in, all describing the same sweet treat before their symptoms began. Children were hit especially hard, many dying within a day. Adults fared little better. By the end of the week, the death toll had risen to 20, and more than 200 others were left gravely ill. The tragedy shocked the nation not only for its scale, but for its sheer senselessness. Peppermint lozenges were supposed to soothe, to refresh the breath, not to send entire families to early graves. And yet, because of sloppy practices, careless handling of dangerous substances, and a complete lack of oversight, a humble candy had become a weapon of mass destruction. The investigation quickly laid bare the cascade of errors. The chemist, Charles Hodgson, admitted that arsenic had been stored in a poorly labeled container. His assistant, sent to fetch filler, had scooped the wrong powder. Neil, the confectioner, failed to recognize that his filler looked suspiciously crystalline compared to the usual stuff. And humbug Billy, while innocent of mixing the poison, had sold the sweets without hesitation. In other words, every link in the chain had failed. Victorians were horrified. If candy could kill on this scale, what other foods might be just as dangerous? The Bradford humbug disaster became a symbol of how deeply flawed the food trade had become. Newspapers splashed lurid headlines, and editorials demanded reform. It wasn't just about humbugs anymore. It was about the fact that anyone's dinner table might hide a lethal surprise. The inquest into the deaths was damning. Doctors testified to the horrific suffering of the victims, describing green-tinged vomit and excruciating pain consistent with arsenic poisoning. Chemical analysis of the leftover lozenges confirmed the truth. Each sweet contained nearly a grain of arsenic trioxide, more than enough to kill a healthy adult outright. Victims had been swallowing lethal doses with every minty bite. Shockingly, despite the carnage, no one faced significant punishment. The chemist and confectioner were both deemed negligent, but not criminally liable under existing laws. Humbug Billy himself was quickly released. The tragedy highlighted not just the recklessness of Victorian candy making, but also the toothless state of food safety regulations. If 20 coffins in Bradford couldn't bring justice, what would? Still, the public outrage forced change. The Bradford case became one of the driving forces behind the push for stronger food safety laws in Britain. Reformers pointed to it as proof that laissez-faire attitudes had gone too far, that ordinary consumers were left helpless in the face of unscrupulous or incompetent sellers. The outrage helped galvanize support for stricter controls, laying the groundwork for later legislation. But for the families of Bradford, reform came too late. The victims were mourned in mass funerals, their deaths etched into the collective memory of the town. Parents who had handed their children as sweet as a treat found themselves planning burials instead. Workers who had bought a handful of lozenges for a cheap indulgence were suddenly gone. The humbug disaster wasn't just an accident, it was a betrayal of trust, the shattering of the idea that something so simple and ordinary could be safe, and the nickname Humbug Billy. After 1858, it took on a far darker meaning. They weren't called humbugs because they fooled you. They were humbugs because death showed up with a sweet tooth. If Victorian candy had a mascot, it wasn't the well-dressed shopkeeper behind a polished counter. It was the street vendor, shouting through the smoke of the city, hawking sweets from a cart, a stall, or even just a tray hung around their neck. Street vendors were the lifeblood of the penny candy trade, and their customers were the working poor families who had little to spare but always found a way to scrape together a copper for a treat. For these customers, candy wasn't just sugar, it was joy in its cheapest, most concentrated form, and often it was joy with a lethal catch. The economics of penny candy were brutally simple. For a single coin, you could walk away with a paper twist of brightly colored lozenges, a stick of striped rock, or a few humbugs. To children who spent their days working in mills, selling newspapers, or simply running barefoot through soot-stained alleys, this was luxury incarnate. Adults, too, indulged, factory workers slipping a sweet between shifts, mothers quieting a fussy child with a boiled drop, fathers spending a hard-earned penny on a family treat. When meat was scarce and bread was bland, Candy provided an instant if fleeting burst of pleasure, but the very affordability that made penny candy so irresistible also made it dangerous. Cheap candy could only exist if corners were cut, and in Victorian Britain, that meant corners sharp enough to bleed. Street vendors were at the bottom of the confectionery supply chain. They rarely made the sweets themselves. Instead, they bought in bulk from wholesalers or local candy makers, and since profit margins were thin, vendors went for the cheapest stock they could find. Cheaper stock often meant adulterated sweets, stretched with fillers, colored with toxic dyes, or stored in filthy conditions. If your candy cost a penny, odds are the funeral cost £1. The risks didn't end at production. Storage and selling conditions were abysmal. Vendors often carried sweets in open trays, exposed to coal dust, horse manure, and the constant grime of crowded streets. Glass jars at outdoor stalls might be cracked, letting in rainwater or mold. Sticky hands rummaged through piles of lozenges, ensuring that every sweet was a communal experiment in bacteria sharing. Hygiene, as a concept, was not a Victorian street vendor's strong suit, and yet penny candy wasn't just about taste, it was about belonging. For working-class children, the ritual of gathering coins, running to the vendor and choosing from the jars was a social event. The bright colors of penny sweets stood in stark contrast to the grey monotony of factory life or the threadbare interiors of overcrowded homes. Vendors shouted their wares with theatrical flair, using jingles, rhymes, or sing-song calls to lure in customers. The streets became open-air sweet shops, where the very act of buying was entertainment. The danger of poison didn't always dampen enthusiasm. For one thing, many poor families didn't have the luxury of avoiding risk. Bread might be stretched with alum, milk watered down, beer thinned to near nothing. Candy was just another gamble in a diet full of them. And unlike bread or meat, candy delivered immediate happiness. Parents knew that a half-penny sweet could buy 5 minutes of peace from a child clamoring for attention. Workers knew that a lozenge could make a grueling shift feel a little more bearable. In that equation, long-term consequences took a back seat. Street vendors themselves were often caught in the same trap as their customers. Many were barely scraping by, supplementing other incomes or relying entirely on candy sales to survive. Some were children or widows with no other means of work. They weren't master poisoners, they were hustlers in a cutthroat marketplace, selling whatever stock they could afford. If the supplier's candy was chalky, gritty, or suspiciously colorful, it wasn't their place to ask questions. Their livelihood depended on moving product, not interrogating chemistry. Still, the reputation of street candy began to suffer as stories of poisonings spread. Middle-class families grew wary of buying from carts, favoring proper sweet shops with polished windows and cleaner reputations. The poor, however, often had no alternative. Penny candy remained their sweet of choice because it was the only one they could afford. That economic divide meant that the working classes bore the brunt of the risk. Poisoned candy wasn't evenly distributed. It was another tax on poverty. Accounts from the period describe heartbreaking scenes. Children falling ill after splitting a paper twist of peppermints between friends. Workers doubled over after buying lozenges from a market stall. Families losing multiple members to what should have been a harmless indulgence. The tragedy was compounded by the fact that penny candy had been meant to provide a rare moment of escape. Instead, it sometimes became a death sentence disguised in stripes. Yet, despite the danger, the trade never faltered. Penny candy was addictive, not chemically but emotionally. It represented freedom, choice, and delight in lives that often offered little of any. To a child with a sooty face and aching hands, the chance to press a coin into a vendor's hand and walk away with a pocket full of sweets was worth any risk. In the end, street vendors and penny candy symbolized the paradox of Victorian life. Joy and danger, indulgence and deprivation, all rolled into one boiled sweet. The working poor loved candy because it was theirs, because it was affordable, because it tasted like happiness in a world that often tasted like soot. But in loving it, they also paid the highest price. If there was one demographic that Victorian confectioners knew how to target, it was children. Kids were the heartbeat of the penny candy economy, the wide-eyed customers who pressed their noses against glass jars and begged parents or anyone passing by for a coin to spend. For a single penny, they could transform a dull, soot-stained day into something magical. Candy was their prize, their entertainment, their comfort, and sometimes even their dinner. But as much as candy lit up children's lives, it also darkened them, because when sweets carried hidden poisons, kids were the first to fall, the quickest to suffer, and the least able to recover. Forget the boogeyman. Victorian kids had to fear the jawbreaker of doom. It's not hard to see why children were the biggest candy consumers. Unlike adults, who could occasionally afford theatre tickets, beer or tobacco, children had only one affordable vice: sweets. A penny twist of humbugs or a striped stick of rock could buy them a few minutes of pure bliss. Candy was colourful in a world of drab clothing, flavourful in a diet of bland bread and porridge, and most importantly, cheap enough to feel accessible even to the poorest. For many children, candy was their only taste of luxury, a rare chance to make a choice in a life otherwise dictated by work, school, or strict parents. But children weren't just frequent customers, they were vulnerable in ways adults weren't. Their smaller bodies meant poisons hit harder and faster. A dose of arsenic that might leave an adult bedridden could kill a child outright. Fillers like plaster or brick dust, which might cause indigestion in a grown man, could wreak havoc on a child's fragile system. And because children lacked the skepticism of adults, they never questioned candy that looked too bright or tasted oddly bitter. If it sparkled, if it crunched, if it was sweet, they ate it without hesitation. The cultural rituals around candy only amplified this vulnerability. Children often pooled their coins together, buying larger bags of sweets to share with friends or siblings. This communal snacking meant that a single contaminated batch could spread through an entire classroom or neighborhood in a matter of hours. Imagine 20 children sitting on a curb, passing around striped lozenges that had been bulked out with plaster of Paris. By nightfall, half of them could be sick, and parents would scramble to find doctors who had no real treatment to offer. And then there were the lollipops, an invention that combined candy with novelty. Lollipops were exciting because they weren't just candy. You could carry them around, wave them like a flag, lick them slowly or save them for later. They lasted longer than lozenges or humbugs, which made them especially appealing to children. But longevity also meant prolonged exposure to whatever toxic additives the confectioner had used. A peppermint humbug swallowed in a gulp might deliver a concentrated hit, but a lollipop lingered, letting poison seep steadily into the body. Children's obsession with candy also created an emotional bind for parents. On the one hand, sweets were a cheap way to make kids happy. On the other hand, the growing number of poisonings made parents wary. Yet how do you deny a child the one small indulgence they can afford? Many parents chose to take the risk, reasoning that not every sweet is poisoned. Tragically, sometimes the one they allowed was. Doctors of the time frequently remarked on how many of their youngest patients arrived sick after consuming sweets. Symptoms ranged from vomiting and diarrhea to convulsions, and in severe cases, death. Medical journals recorded tragic accounts of whole families losing multiple children to poisoned candy bought at fairs or markets. And because poor families often relied on penny candy to keep children quiet during long workdays, the risk was constant and unavoidable. Street culture reinforced this cycle. Vendors knew their loudest, most reliable customers were children, and they advertised accordingly. Candy carts were often parked outside schools, factories where child laborers worked, or along the busiest streets where children played. Vendors shouted slogans, displayed the brightest colors, and sometimes even gave away small samples to hook young customers. Kids would swarm stalls like bees to flowers, often without realizing they were stepping into a chemical minefield. And the irony: Victorians often moralized about candy consumption, scolding children for indulging too much, warning about rotting teeth or spoiled appetites. Yet the real danger wasn't overindulgence, it was that even a single piece might be loaded with enough arsenic, lead, or brick dust to undo a child permanently. The lecture about too many sweets masked the darker truth. It wasn't greed that threatened children, it was negligence. The tragedy of Victorian candy culture is that the very group who adored sweets most was also the group most frequently betrayed by them. Children turned to candy for happiness in lives often defined by hardship. They were promised magic in a humbug, delight in a lollipop, and sweetness in a world that could be cruel. What they got, all too often, was illness, suffering, or an early grave. In that sense, candy was both the symbol of Victorian childhood and its curse. Every child who skipped down the street with a sticky jawbreaker was carrying both a badge of joy and a hidden risk. For some, it ended with nothing worse than a stomachache and a scolding from their mother. For others, it ended with a coffin, and so while adults fretted about politics and industry, Victorian children waged their own daily gamble, one jawbreaker at a time. If someone today bit into a chocolate bar and ended up in the emergency room, it would ignite a social media firestorm, a lawsuit, and probably a Netflix documentary. But in Victorian Britain, people often treated poisoned food as just one more inconvenience in life. A child might die from a bad humbug, a neighbor might collapse after a bowl of soup stretched with alum, and the general public reaction was not outrage but a weary shrug. They shrugged it off like we shrug off Wi-Fi going down annoying, but survivable for everyone else. To understand this attitude, you have to put yourself in Victorian shoes, preferably sturdy boots, because the streets were lined with horse manure and open sewers. Daily life was already a gamble. Infectious diseases like cholera, typhoid, and smallpox struck without warning. Infant mortality rates were sky high. Factory accidents were common. Fires, drownings, and random outbreaks of foodborne illness were all part of the background noise of existence. When you lived in a world where death constantly lurked around the corner, one more hazard like a dodgy peppermint didn't feel extraordinary. Food adulteration wasn't confined to candy either. Milk was watered down and improved with chalk. Beer was diluted and sometimes laced with questionable ingredients to mimic strength. Bread often contained alum to make it whiter and more appealing, despite its nasty side effects. With every meal, Victorians risked ingesting something harmful. Candy was just the most colourful example. The idea that food could be dangerous was so baked into culture that people accepted it as inevitable. This acceptance was reinforced by the lack of strong consumer protections. Government oversight was minimal, and many authorities embraced laissez-faire economics. Let the market sort itself out. If a vendor's food killed too many customers, the logic went, people would stop buying from him. The victims, of course, didn't get refunds, but the philosophy persisted. Without robust laws or inspections, the burden of caution fell squarely on the consumer, and let's be honest, most consumers didn't have the means to be cautious. For the poor, avoiding adulterated food was nearly impossible. A working-class family might only afford the cheapest bread, the weakest beer, and the brightest penny candy, all of which were the most likely to be tampered with. Complaining wasn't an option. Survival meant taking what you could get. If little Annie fell sick after a toffee, her family might grieve, but they couldn't boycott candy altogether. It was woven into daily life. Another factor was ignorance, both genuine and willful. Many people didn't know the science behind food adulteration. Symptoms like vomiting, weakness, or chronic illness could be blamed on bad air, weak constitutions, or divine punishment. Without clear cause and effect understanding, poisonings became just one of many unexplained misfortunes. Even when suspicions arose, the prevailing attitude was fatalistic. Everything carried risk, so why single out candy? The newspapers played a double role here. On the one hand, they loved sensational headlines about poisoned sweets and mass illness. On the other hand, their very frequency may have dulled the shock. When every few weeks a story appeared about a tainted loaf or a batch of toxic lozenges, the public started treating them like weather reports, serious but routine. Ah yes, rain in Manchester, smog in London, and 30 people sick from sweets in Yorkshire. Business as usual. There was also the Victorian obsession with progress to consider. This was an age that prided itself on industry, invention, and innovation. New products appeared constantly, and not all of them were safe. Exploding lamps, collapsing bridges, and faulty medicines were part of the march forward. People accepted a certain level of failure as the cost of advancement. In this context, poisoned food wasn't a shocking betrayal, it was collateral damage in a rapidly changing world. Cultural attitudes toward risk were shaped by class as well. The wealthy were somewhat insulated. They could afford food from trusted suppliers, private cooks, and higher quality ingredients. For them, poisoned candy was a curiosity reported in the papers, not a daily threat. For the poor, it was simply part of existence. They bore the brunt of risk because they had no alternatives, and society at large barely blinked. What's remarkable is how little long-term outrage these poisonings sparked compared to what we'd expect today. A disaster like the Bradford humbugs grabbed headlines, yes, but it took dozens of deaths to move the needle. Smaller incidents barely registered. A handful of children sick from a fairground stall might earn a paragraph in the local paper, then fade into silence. There was no mass boycott, no rush for reform at least, not until repeated disasters forced Parliament's hand years later. So why did Victorians normalise poison in their food? Partly because danger was everywhere already, partly because poverty left them with no real choice, and partly because they lacked the scientific understanding and consumer protections we now take for granted. To them, eating was always a gamble. Candy just happened to be a particularly colourful version of Russian roulette. In the end, poisoned candy didn't destroy public faith in sweets. It simply joined the long list of daily hazards. Victorians still bought their humbugs, their lollipops, their toffees. They knew the risks, but they also knew life was short, brutal, and unpredictable. If a sweet killed you, at least you'd gone out with a taste of sugar on your tongue. When a batch of candy killed or sickened dozens of Victorians, you might imagine the sweet maker collapsing in horror, wringing his hands and confessing, "Forgive me, I have poisoned the children." But more often than not, what customers got instead was a shrug, a half-hearted apology, and an excuse that sounded like it belonged in a comedy sketch. It wasn't me, it was the flour guy. Classic Victorian version of "my account got hacked." Confectioners rarely saw themselves as villains. They thought of themselves as humble tradesmen, just trying to turn sugar into pennies. When disasters struck, they leaned heavily on a familiar repertoire of defenses. The first and most popular was ignorance. I had no idea that powder was arsenic. How was I supposed to know brick dust doesn't belong in candy? This excuse worked surprisingly well, since many shopkeepers genuinely lacked scientific training. If a salesman swore that a bright green dye was safe, why doubt him? Of course, the 20 customers vomiting blood might disagree with that logic, but by then the sweet maker was already pointing fingers elsewhere. The second go-to excuse was blaming suppliers. Confectioners argued they were victims too, tricked into buying tainted or mislabeled ingredients. A batch of plaster passed off as flour or arsenic, mistaken for filler, could easily be blamed on a careless chemist or warehouse clerk. In fact, this was exactly what happened in the infamous Bradford poisoning. The confectioner Joseph Neal claimed he had no idea his filler was lethal, since the chemist's apprentice had handed him the wrong bag. By this logic, Neal wasn't responsible. He was just a tragic middleman in a supply chain made of bad luck and bad labeling. Another common defense was minimization. Some confectioners argued that the amount of toxic filler wasn't really that dangerous. Surely a sprinkle of alum or plaster couldn't hurt anyone. Victims who fell ill were chalked up, sometimes literally, to weak stomachs, poor hygiene, or general frailty. This was the culinary equivalent of, "Well, it didn't hurt me when I tried it," conveniently ignoring that adult men had sturdier constitutions than 6-year-olds chewing jawbreakers. And then there was the excuse of tradition. Many argued that adulteration was simply the way things had always been done. If bakers stretched flour with chalk, brewers watered down beer, and milkmen topped off pails with river water, why should candy be held to a higher standard? To them, the question wasn't, "Is my product safe?" but rather, "Am I doing anything worse than the guy next door?" By this reasoning, poison became less a crime than a competitive strategy. Some confectioners tried passing the buck upward. suggesting that if customers wanted better quality, the government should regulate it. Until then, they'd keep doing what everyone else did, maximize profits, minimize costs, and hope nobody noticed when the occasional customer dropped dead. Conveniently, this argument cast them as victims of a flawed system rather than perpetrators of individual negligence. Others leaned on deniability through popularity, where they'd point to the hundreds of satisfied customers who hadn't keeled over as proof their candy was fine. If 2 children died after eating a batch of humbugs, but 98 others walked away with sticky fingers and smiles, wasn't that just bad luck? The implication was clear. Survival statistics favored the sweet maker. Perhaps the most audacious defense of all was silence. Some confectioners simply vanished from towns where poisonings occurred, closing shop and reappearing elsewhere under a new name. With weak record-keeping and no formal licensing, it was relatively easy to disappear from one marketplace and pop up in another, ready to start the whole deadly cycle anew. The sheer brazenness of these excuses highlights how little accountability existed in the Victorian food trade. Courts sometimes held inquests, but prosecutions were rare, and convictions rarer still. Jurors often sympathized with small tradesmen, seeing them as uneducated workers rather than malicious killers. If a confectioner could convincingly claim ignorance or point to a sloppy supplier, they often walked free, leaving grieving families with little more than moral outrage. But there's another layer to these excuses. They reflect the precariousness of working-class life. Many sweet makers weren't wealthy businessmen but struggling shopkeepers trying to eke out a living. Margins were razor-thin, competition was fierce, and customers demanded cheap prices. Cutting corners wasn't just laziness, it was often survival. Excuses weren't only about evading blame, they were about painting oneself as just another cog in a broken system. Still, to the families burying their children, these excuses rang hollow. What comfort was it to hear that the candy had been poisoned by mistake? What solace came from knowing your child's death was a clerical error at the chemist's warehouse? Inquests often recorded heartbreaking testimonies from parents who trusted their local sweet maker, only to see that trust betrayed. And yet, time after time, the cycle continued. Poisoning, outcry, excuses, and silence. The excuses were enough to calm authorities, enough to allow trade to continue, and enough to ensure that poisoned candy remained a recurring feature of Victorian life. It wasn't me, it was the flour guy. It wasn't me, it was the chemist. It wasn't me, it was tradition. In short, it wasn't me. And as long as those excuses were accepted, the candy trade rolled on, sweet on the outside, toxic at the core. As horrifying as poisoned candy was, it wasn't an isolated case of Victorian culinary chaos. In fact, sweets were merely the sugary tip of a very grim iceberg. If you sat down to a typical Victorian meal, you weren't just feeding yourself, you were auditioning for a role in a toxicology textbook. Dinner didn't nourish you. It auditioned as an assassination attempt. Take bread for starters, the staple of the working-class diet. The cheapest loaves were often whitened with alum, a compound that gave bread a fashionable pale look and kept it firmer for longer. To the poor, white bread carried a stigma of respectability. It looked refined, literally. But alum was harsh on the stomach, particularly for children, leading to chronic indigestion, weakness, and in extreme cases poisoning. Bakers also stretched their flour with chalk or powdered bones. Customers thought they were buying wholesome loaves. In reality, they were chewing a small slice of the local quarry. If bread didn't get you, milk might. Proper fresh milk was expensive, and milkmen quickly learned that profits multiplied if they extended it with water. Sometimes it was clean water. More often it was whatever water was cheapest to fetch, including straight from polluted rivers or wells. To disguise the watery look, milkmen stirred in additives like chalk or even pureed calf brains to thicken it. Yes, that meant Victorian children sometimes washed down their bread with brain-enhanced milk. Nutritious, in the sense that it was unforgettable. Beer, too, came under suspicion. Adulteration here was as much about economics as effect. Brewers eager to stretch their batches might water down ale and then restore its kick with dubious additions. Cocculus indicus, a toxic berry, was one such additive, prized because it intensified the intoxicating effect. In other words, your pint might have been laced with poison to make it feel stronger. Other brewers added salt, tobacco, or even iron sulfate to mimic bitterness. Drinkers were less likely to complain about quality when they were too busy reeling from side effects. And if you thought vegetables were safe, think again. Pickles and jams were often tinted with copper salts to give them a vivid, market-friendly color. Green peas, for instance, didn't stay green for long after harvest. To restore their freshness, sellers soaked them in copper sulfate solutions until they gleamed with an artificial brightness. Customers thought they were buying a taste of spring. In reality, they were buying a digestive system that would stage a rebellion. Jams were no better. Red hues sometimes came courtesy of lead-based dyes. Sweet on toast, sour in the bloodstream. Tea, that sacred British drink, wasn't immune either. Genuine tea leaves were expensive, so unscrupulous sellers padded supplies with dried hawthorn leaves, used tea leaves re-dyed with green copper salts, or even leaves from random plants swept up from hedgerows. Some tea blends bore as much resemblance to real tea as gravel does to caviar, yet the ritual of tea drinking was so ingrained that most households couldn't give it up, no matter how suspicious the leaves looked. Even luxuries bore risks. Coffee was stretched with roasted chicory, beans, or even ground acorns. Sometimes baker's waste or animal droppings found their way into the mix. Spices like pepper were bulked with ground nutshells or dust. Sugar itself was occasionally cut with sand or powdered glass, ensuring that sweetening your tea doubled as dental erosion. The cumulative effect was staggering. A Victorian family might start their day with alum-laced bread, brain-thickened milk, and copper-soaked peas at dinner, with a side of beer flavored with toxic berries. Candy was just the glittering dessert at the end of a meal, already rich in hazards. In fact, some reformers argued that focusing too much on poisoned sweets was a distraction from the broader crisis of adulteration across the entire food system. Why did this happen? The same reasons candy suffered: high demand, low regulation, and fierce competition. Profit margins were everything. Wholesalers, retailers, and small tradesmen all faced pressure to offer the cheapest product possible. Cutting costs with additives wasn't just common, it was expected. Honest sellers were undercut by dishonest ones, forcing many to adopt the same practices to survive. It was a toxic race to the bottom, with consumers left holding the bag and often holding their stomachs. Public reaction mirrored the candy scandals, bursts of outrage after major poisonings, followed by resigned acceptance. Everyone knew adulteration was rife, but without alternatives, the poor had little choice but to keep buying. For them, it was either tainted food or no food at all. Middle-class consumers fared somewhat better, since they could afford higher quality suppliers. But even they weren't immune. As one reformer quipped, "There is not a loaf, pint or cup in England that is entirely what it pretends to be." The candy trade may have drawn the most headlines, perhaps because it targeted children so directly. But in reality, it was part of a much larger Victorian pattern: the normalization of poison in the name of profit. Dinner was dangerous, drinks were suspect, and dessert might be deadly. If the Victorians survived at all, it was less due to culinary safety and more because their digestive systems developed the resilience of iron stomachs. So while candy made for the most dramatic cautionary tales, it was hardly alone in its treachery. The entire Victorian menu was a booby trap disguised as nourishment. Candy was the colourful finale, yes, but the appetizer and main course were already auditioning as assassins. Victorian Britain loved two things with equal passion: sweets and scandals. Whenever the two collided, newspapers had a field day. The candy trade might have been fueled by sugar, but its darker side was fueled by ink. Headlines screamed, "Death in a bonbon," basically Victorian clickbait without the pop-ups. Readers devoured every gory detail of poisoned humbugs, tainted lozenges, and tragic funerals, while editors rubbed their hands at the sales figures. The press was uniquely positioned to turn isolated poisonings into national spectacles. Local outbreaks that might once have stayed confined to parish gossip now reached readers hundreds of miles away. The rapid growth of cheap newspapers, fueled by improved printing presses and rising literacy, meant stories spread like wildfire. One poisoned fairground could become dinner-table conversation across the country within days. And since candy was a universal pleasure, everyone could picture themselves, or worse, their children, as the next victims. These reports often blended fact with sensationalism. It wasn't enough to say, arsenic poisoning confirmed. No, journalists described the color of the vomit, the contorted faces of the dying, the keening cries of parents. Inquests were covered blow by blow, with witnesses' quotes splashed across front pages. Readers were treated to a macabre theater of suffering, made all the more horrifying by the everyday nature of the culprit. A peppermint lozenge, a stick of rock, a bag of humbugs. Public outrage was immediate and visceral. Candy wasn't an obscure delicacy, it was a household treat. The thought that something so innocent could be lethal shocked even the most hardened readers. Politicians, reformers, and religious leaders seized on these scandals to argue for moral and legislative change. For them, poisoned candy wasn't just about consumer safety. It was about the corruption of society, the neglect of the poor, and the dangers of unregulated capitalism. Of course, not everyone shared the same motives. For reformers, these stories were ammunition in the fight for food safety laws. For rival confectioners, they were opportunities to badmouth competitors, and for newspapers, it was good business. A steady diet of candy deaths kept readers hooked. The public might have lost their appetite for humbugs, but they couldn't get enough of humbug headlines. The scandals also revealed class tensions. Middle-class families reading about penny candy poisonings often expressed moralistic horror, not only at the deaths but at the idea of their children buying from grubby street vendors. The poor were portrayed as both victims and, paradoxically, as reckless consumers who risked everything for cheap treats. Meanwhile, the wealthy congratulated themselves on avoiding street sweets. Never mind that their own dinner tables sometimes featured equally adulterated bread or milk. Candy scandals became morality tales about thrift, ignorance, and the dangers of indulgence. And yet the cycle repeated. Each new poisoning prompted a surge of outrage, editorials demanding reform and finger-pointing at careless sweetmakers. But once the headlines faded, life returned to normal. Penny candy carts reappeared on the streets, children pressed their noses to glass jars again, parents, wary but weary, handed over pennies. The sweet tooth was strong, and memory was short, until, inevitably, the next scandal broke. Some newspapers leaned into satire, mocking the excuses of confectioners or the complacency of officials. Cartoons showed skeletal figures handing candy to children, or demons stirring cauldrons of peppermints. These images burned into the public imagination, reinforcing the sense that candy had become a Trojan horse for death. Yet satire didn't make the sweets safer, it just made the scandals more memorable. What made candy scandals particularly effective in stirring outrage was their contrast with other food adulteration stories. Tales of alum in bread or chalk in milk were troubling, yes, but they affected adults as much as children. Poisoned candy, by contrast, struck at the heart of Victorian sentimentality. Childhood was romanticized as a time of innocence, and candy was its edible symbol. When candy turned killer, it felt like a betrayal of childhood itself. That betrayal was headline gold. It also provided a platform for broader debates about morality. Religious leaders thundered from pulpits about greed, sin, and the dangers of cheap pleasure. Reformers argued that candy poisonings were symptoms of industrial society's decay, and ordinary readers passing newspapers around factories and homes shook their heads in disgust while continuing to buy the very sweets under suspicion. The scandals weren't just about death, they were about trust. Every jar of humbugs, every bag of lozenges was now shadowed by doubt. Did the vendor cut costs? Was the green dye really mint or arsenic? Could you let your child spend their penny without risking their life? That cloud of suspicion lingered long after the headlines faded, eroding faith in the entire food system. Still, for all the outrage, the press didn't necessarily inspire immediate change. It would take decades and repeated tragedies before meaningful legislation forced confectioners to clean up their act. But what the press did do was plant the idea that food safety was a public concern, not just a private misfortune. Candy scandals helped transform poisonings from bad luck into political ammunition. And so, every time a child collapsed after a peppermint or an inquest revealed a deadly batch of humbugs, the press was there to amplify the story. They made candy both terrifying and irresistible, selling horror in neat, digestible columns. In the end, Victorian newspapers didn't just report on candy scandals, they turned them into a national obsession, the sticky, tragic stories that everyone couldn't stop reading. When poisoned candy struck, it wasn't the confectioners who bore the immediate brunt, it was the doctors. Suddenly, medical men across Britain found themselves staring at patients who had gone from nibbling peppermints to writhing in agony within hours. Diagnosing candy poisoning wasn't easy, especially when medical science was still fumbling its way through the murky world of toxicology. Yet, case by case, hospital records and doctors' notes began to reveal a grimly consistent picture. Sweets that should have brought delight were instead delivering death. The symptoms often arrived quickly. Patients complained first of stomach cramps, then waves of nausea, followed by violent vomiting. In severe cases, diarrhea and convulsions set in, alongside terrifying sensations like burning throats or numb limbs. Arsenic in particular left its calling cards: greenish vomit, weakness and collapse. Lead caused paralysis and abdominal agony. Copper dyes turned tongues and lips odd shades of blue or green. For doctors, the clues were obvious once enough patients had piled in. But in the heat of the moment, they were simply confronted with a ward full of people who all seemed to have eaten the same thing. Hospitals were overwhelmed during major outbreaks. In the aftermath of events like the Bradford humbug disaster, wards were crammed with patients sprawled on benches and floors, groaning, vomiting, or drifting in and out of consciousness. Doctors dashed from bed to bed with the limited arsenal of treatments available. Induce vomiting if it hadn't already started, administer milk or egg whites to soothe the stomach lining, and hope that the poison passed before the patient did. Activated charcoal, one of the few genuinely useful remedies, was available but not always employed correctly. For many patients, survival came down to sheer luck and constitution. Treatment options were simple: vomit, pray, and hope the doctor wasn't also your candy dealer. What made things even trickier was that Victorian doctors didn't have modern diagnostic tools. No blood tests, no quick scans, just observation and experience. Some physicians were remarkably sharp at identifying candy as the culprit. Medical journals of the time contain reports of doctors who noticed clusters of children all falling ill after eating the same sweet from the same vendor. Others, however, attributed symptoms to cholera, bad air, or mysterious seasonal maladies. Only when poisonings hit on a massive scale did the link become undeniable. Forensic toxicology was still in its infancy, but it became increasingly important during these scandals. Chemists working alongside doctors analyzed suspicious candies, often finding staggering concentrations of arsenic, lead, or other adulterants. Reports from these analyses were published in medical journals and newspapers, sometimes in horrifying detail. One batch of humbugs was found to contain enough arsenic to kill hundreds, each lozenge a lethal bullet disguised as candy. These reports didn't just diagnose patients, they turned into evidence for public inquests and eventually for reformers demanding change. Doctors also noted the uneven toll poison candy took on different groups. Children, as expected, died in larger numbers and with greater speed. Women were often overrepresented among the sick, perhaps because they were more likely to indulge children with sweets or buy them as household treats. Men, too, fell victim, but doctors often noted their bodies could sometimes withstand larger doses. The differences highlighted what everyone already suspected: candy was hitting the most vulnerable hardest. What's striking in medical accounts is the sheer helplessness physicians expressed. Even the best doctors of the time could do little more than manage symptoms. Some prescribed opiates to ease pain, others bled patients in misguided attempts to balance humors, and many resorted to prayers at the bedside. Success rates varied wildly. Some patients rallied within a day, vomiting out much of the toxin. Others lingered for agonizing days before succumbing. Doctors recorded these cases with clinical detachment, but between the lines you can sense their frustration. Inquests often summoned doctors to testify. Their grim descriptions of patients' suffering lent weight to the horror. Jurors heard about stomachs eaten away by corrosive dyes, children convulsing until their last breath, or patients who died in dreadful agony after innocently enjoying a sweet. These testimonies carried weight, especially in newspapers, where doctors were treated as authoritative witnesses to society's betrayal of its own people. And yet, for all their expertise, doctors weren't immune to the culture of excuses. Some downplayed the role of adulteration, suggesting patients had weak constitutions. Others hesitated to assign blame, wary of attacking tradesmen whose livelihoods depended on sugar. But as case after case filled hospital wards, the evidence was impossible to ignore. Medical consensus grew. Adulterated candy wasn't just a nuisance, it was a recurring killer. These repeated encounters with poisoned patients also shaped the medical profession itself. They highlighted the need for better toxicological training, encouraged collaborations between doctors and chemists, and spurred debates about the responsibilities of the state to protect public health. Poisoned candy, in other words, wasn't just killing patients, it was pushing medicine grudgingly toward modernity. For the victims, though, these shifts came too late. For every child saved by a timely dose of milk or charcoal, another slipped away. Doctors might write reports and chemists might produce damning analyses, but to families the result was the same: grief over a sweet that was supposed to be harmless. Hospitals became the tragic backdrop for a story of indulgence turned lethal, where the very people trusted to heal could do little more than bear witness. In the long run, the medical records of poisoned patients became part of the public narrative that reformers wielded like weapons. Every symptom described, every stomach pumped, every coroner's report added fuel to the fire of outrage. Doctors couldn't always save their patients, but they could at least ensure that their suffering was documented. And in Victorian Britain, documented suffering was the first step toward change. If you were unlucky enough to pop a Victorian humbug laced with arsenic, the results weren't subtle. Your body went into full-scale revolt, staging what might be described as the most unpleasant protest in human history. Forget a sugar rush, this was a sugar crash, a stomach apocalypse, and a one-way ticket to the grave if the dose was high enough. Side effects may include nausea, diarrhea, and a permanent dirt nap, arsenic trioxide, the form most commonly used in dyes and accidentally slipped into candy, is a potent cellular disruptor. It doesn't explode in your mouth or burn your throat. Instead, it sabotages the machinery inside your body. Once swallowed, arsenic interferes with the enzymes that help your cells produce energy. Imagine pulling the plug on your body's power stations. Muscles weaken, organs falter, and nothing runs quite right. The more arsenic in your system, the faster the collapse. The first wave of symptoms usually hit within hours. Victims complained of searing stomach pain, as though they'd swallowed hot coals. Nausea followed, then relentless vomiting. Fluids poured out of the body from both ends, leaving sufferers dehydrated and racked with cramps. The vomiting was often violent enough to rupture blood vessels, leaving traces of blood mixed with the bitter fluids. Contemporary reports described patients retching without ceasing, their bodies convulsing in a desperate attempt to purge the poison. Next came diarrhea, explosive, unstoppable, and dangerous in itself. Combined with vomiting, this left patients weak, shivering and gasping for water. Their skin sometimes turned clammy and pale, lips bluish, eyes sunken. Doctors described them as looking hollowed out, drained of life long before death arrived. In severe cases, victims collapsed into shock, their pulse faint, their breath shallow. But arsenic didn't stop at the stomach. It also attacked the nervous system. Some victims reported tingling or numbness in their hands and feet, followed by difficulty walking or even paralysis. Others experienced muscle spasms and convulsions, jerking uncontrollably as their bodies failed to coordinate basic functions. In extreme cases, the nervous collapse was so rapid that patients lost the ability to speak or swallow before dying. One of the cruelest aspects of arsenic poisoning was its deceptive progression. A smaller dose might not kill outright, but instead linger in the body, causing chronic illness. Long-term exposure could leave victims with blackened fingernails, skin lesions, or swollen limbs. Some suffered from neuropathy, losing sensation in their extremities. Others developed cancers or organ failure years later. In short, arsenic wasn't just a sprinter, it was a marathoner, capable of tormenting victims long after the initial sweet was gone. Victorian doctors and chemists, once they began studying these cases closely, grew adept at recognizing arsenic's telltale signs. Patients with relentless vomiting and diarrhea who all reported eating the same sweets raised immediate red flags. Coroners, too, became familiar with the grisly post-mortem clues: inflamed stomach linings, ulcerated intestines, and traces of arsenic crystals left in the body. By the mid-19th century, tests like the Marsh test, a chemical analysis that could detect arsenic in even tiny amounts, gave scientists a powerful tool to confirm suspicions. Still, by the time the diagnosis was certain, it was often too late for the patient. For families, watching a loved one succumb was a nightmare. Accounts described children crying out in pain, mothers collapsing beside their sickened toddlers, and fathers weakened beyond recognition after a handful of lozenges. Symptoms came on so quickly that by the time a doctor was summoned, the poison had already tightened its grip. Victorians lived in constant fear of diseases like cholera, but candy poisoning carried an extra sting. It masqueraded as pleasure before revealing itself as punishment. The sheer unpredictability of arsenic's effects only heightened the terror. A person might survive one batch of contaminated sweets, only to fall dead from the next. Two children might share the same bag of lozenges, with one recovering after a night of misery and the other dying before dawn. The difference often came down to body weight, constitution, or sheer luck. To consumers, this randomness made candy feel like Russian roulette. Every treat could be the bullet. Medical reports from the time are chilling in their detail. One doctor described patients whose violent retchings and looseness continued until death put an end to their sufferings. Another noted how the victims' bodies twisted in agony, their faces contorted, their cries unceasing. For reformers, these accounts were powerful weapons in the campaign for regulation. If reading about arsenic poisoning didn't make you think twice about penny candy, nothing would. It's grimly ironic that arsenic, so deadly in candy, was also marketed in small doses as a health and beauty aid. Some Victorians took arsenic wafers to improve their complexion, while others believed tiny amounts could build stamina. The very substance that was killing people in lozenges was being swallowed voluntarily in parlours. But while the self-medicating elite could afford controlled doses, the poor had no such choice. Their arsenic came hidden in humbugs, with no warning and no escape. In the end, the science of arsenic poisoning revealed what Victorians had long suspected. Their beloved sweets weren't just indulgent, they were treacherous. Every symptom, the vomiting, the cramps, the paralysis, was a cruel reminder that behind the glittering colours lay one of nature's deadliest elements. And though doctors could describe these symptoms in meticulous detail, they could rarely cure them. For many victims, the science of arsenic wasn't just an academic subject. It was a death sentence in candy wrapping. When a child collapsed after eating a peppermint, or an entire household fell sick from a bag of humbugs, the explanation wasn't always arsenic. To Victorian minds, the reasons could be far stranger. Candy poisonings didn't just fuel calls for reform. They fed the older, deeper traditions of paranoia and superstition. In a world where science was still elbowing its way into authority, many people turned to witches, curses, or divine punishment to make sense of their suddenly lethal lollipops. Sometimes your grandma blamed the devil. Spoiler, it was the taffy. One reason superstition clung so tightly was that candy itself carried an aura of the unnatural. Bright green lozenges, neon yellow drops, or unnaturally pink sweets looked more like alchemical curiosities than food. For older generations raised on plain bread and simple fare, these glowing confections seemed suspicious. Tempting, yes, but also uncanny. If a child fell ill after eating them, it wasn't hard to imagine whispers that the sweets were bewitched. Witches and poison had a long shared history in the European imagination. Medieval tales were full of hags brewing potions, and the idea that an enemy might slip you a tainted treat was already embedded in folklore. Victorian candy poisonings slotted neatly into this tradition. In some rural areas, rumors spread that poisoned sweets weren't accidents at all, but deliberate plots by malevolent forces, whether human rivals, jealous neighbors, or even practitioners of dark magic. If Mrs. So-and-so had been giving you dirty looks at church and your son happened to die after eating a lozenge, the connection seemed obvious. The paranoia didn't stop at witches. Victorians were fond of conspiracy theories, and poisoned candy fed them nicely. Some imagined that foreign powers, especially the French, were trying to undermine British health by infiltrating the food supply. Others suspected secret societies or anarchists of distributing poisoned sweets as a form of mass murder, while newspapers often explained poisonings in terms of negligence or adulteration. Rumor mills ran wilder. Perhaps it isn't sloppy shopkeepers, some said. Perhaps it's deliberate sabotage. Religious interpretations also flourished. To preachers already wary of worldly indulgences, candy seemed like a sinful temptation ripe for divine punishment. What better way for God to chastise a gluttonous society than by turning its favorite treat into poison? Sermons warned that children's craving for sweets mirrored adults' craving for luxury, and both could end in ruin. In this sense, candy poisonings weren't just accidents. They were moral lessons written in stomach cramps. Parents, desperate to make sense of tragedy, sometimes latched onto omens. A crow circling above the house, a mirror breaking, or a clock stopping on the morning of a candy poisoning, could all be cited as signs that disaster was foretold. These associations helped grieving families give shape to the randomness of loss. After all, blaming arsenic felt cold and impersonal. Blaming a curse or a sign gave the death a kind of narrative, tragic, but somehow meaningful. The paranoia also extended to ordinary interactions. Street vendors selling brightly colored sweets sometimes found themselves accused of witchcraft or deliberate malice. A vendor who seemed too eager to sell, or whose candies looked unnaturally vivid, might be avoided altogether. Children were warned to steer clear of suspicious vendors, though what counted as suspicious often boiled down to little more than prejudice. In poorer neighborhoods, rival vendors even spread rumors that their competitors' candy was cursed, turning fear into a marketing strategy. Not all paranoia was mystical. Some was deeply social. Middle-class Victorians, already skeptical of street food, used candy poisonings to reinforce their disdain for the working class. They whispered that poor families were reckless, feeding their children dubious sweets instead of wholesome meals. In their view, poisoned candy wasn't just bad luck, it was the inevitable result of poverty, ignorance, and poor parenting. These judgments carried a moralistic edge, turning tragedy into fodder for class prejudice. Still, superstition thrived in the gaps where science faltered. When doctors failed to save victims or chemists couldn't explain exactly how poison entered a batch, people filled the void with stories of curses, plots, and devils in disguise. Even as toxicology advanced, the old fears never quite vanished. The sight of a green lozenge could still stir unease, not only because of arsenic, but because of centuries-old associations with witchcraft and sorcery. Ironically, the sensationalist press sometimes encouraged these paranoias. While official reports focused on arsenic content and supplier negligence, the more theatrical newspapers printed illustrations of demons stirring cauldrons of candy or witches handing out sweets to children. These images blended moral panic with superstition, reinforcing the idea that candy wasn't just physically dangerous, it was spiritually suspect. For children, these fears often translated into whispered playground lore. Stories spread of cursed candies that made tongues fall out, or of shadowy figures who handed out sweets that killed. Some of these tales foreshadow the poisoned Halloween candy legends that circulate today, myths rooted in real tragedies but amplified into enduring urban folklore. In the end, paranoia and superstition provided Victorians with a way to cope. Poisoned candy was terrifying precisely because it was so ordinary, so intimate, so avoidable yet unavoidable. Casting blame on witches, foreigners, curses, or the wrath of God gave the horror a framework, something more dramatic than the mundane truth of sloppy confectioners and careless chemists. It transformed senseless accidents into stories, tragedies into lessons, and personal loss into collective folklore. So while arsenic, copper, and plaster were the real culprits, the Victorian imagination insisted on adding another layer. Sometimes your grandma blamed the devil. Spoiler, it was the taffy. In Victorian Britain, what you ate, and how dangerous it was, had less to do with luck and more to do with class. Food was never just sustenance, it was a marker of wealth, identity, and trust. And when it came to sweets, the divide between rich and poor was as stark as a marble-floored dining room compared to a soot-stained alley. If you could afford a chef, your candy sparkled. If you couldn't, your candy sparked. For the working poor, penny candy was irresistible. It was cheap, colourful, and accessible from the vendor around the corner. A paper twist of humbugs or lozenges could be bought with a single coin, making candy one of the few luxuries in a life dominated by drudgery. But because poor families depended on the cheapest options, they were also the most exposed to adulteration. Their sweets often came from bulk supplies, churned out in cramped backrooms where quality was measured not by safety but by profit margin. Meanwhile, the wealthy had access to a very different kind of indulgence. For them, candy was purchased not from street vendors but from reputable confectioners with gleaming storefronts in central London, Bath, or Edinburgh. These shops catered to aristocrats and the rising middle class, offering bonbons, sugared almonds, and imported chocolates wrapped in delicate paper. Their sweets were status symbols, often served in elegant silver dishes at soirees. While no food was completely safe, the wealthy's access to higher quality suppliers and imported goods insulated them from the worst dangers. Class also shaped how much trust consumers could place in their vendors. The rich trusted their butlers or cooks to source safe ingredients, often from suppliers with reputations to maintain. The poor had no such luxury. They placed their trust in anonymous street sellers or local shopkeepers who might buy their stock from the cheapest wholesaler. If a batch went bad, the poor had little recourse. Complaints carried no weight and the law was rarely on their side. This uneven trust created uneven risk. For the poor, every purchase was a gamble. They couldn't scrutinize ingredients or demand accountability. They simply hoped that today's humbug wouldn't be their last. For the wealthy, by contrast, candy was a stage on which to display refinement. They worried about appearance. Did the chocolates impress the guests? Far more than safety. The risks weren't equal, because the suppliers weren't equal. And yet class attitudes added insult to injury. Middle-class newspapers often framed candy poisonings as the misfortune of the lower classes. Penny candy was portrayed as grubby, risky, and emblematic of the poor's supposed lack of restraint. If children in a slum sickened after eating lozenges, moralists wagged fingers at indulgent parents rather than unscrupulous vendors. The subtext was clear. The poor had brought it on themselves by choosing cheap thrills over wholesome food. This moralizing tone obscured the structural reality that poverty left no alternatives. For reformers, however, the class divide became a powerful talking point. Campaigners argued that while the wealthy could buy their way to safer food, the poor were trapped in a system that exploited them. Penny candy wasn't just a treat, it was evidence of inequality, showing how society allowed its most vulnerable members to shoulder the highest risks. Every poisoned humbug was a reminder that Britain's booming industrial wealth did not translate into protection for the working class. Trust in the food system itself also fractured along class lines. For wealthier Victorians, Trust was placed in reputation and appearance. If a sweet came in a fancy wrapper or was displayed in a fashionable shop, it was assumed to be safe. For the poor, trust was more personal. They relied on familiarity with local vendors. If Mrs. Smith had sold candy in the market for years, families trusted her by default, even if she had no more control over her suppliers than they did. When poisonings occurred, that fragile trust could shatter overnight, leaving communities shaken not just by death but by betrayal. There was also a geographical divide. In urban centers, the poor were bombarded with cheap candy stalls, while the rich clustered around high-end confectioners. In rural areas, however, everyone depended on a small number of local suppliers. There, trust became even more personal, and betrayals even more devastating. A single bad batch could wipe out half a village's confidence in its shopkeeper. The tragedy is that candy should have been one of the few pleasures that united classes. Sweetness is universal. Children in silk frocks and children in patched rags alike clamored for it. But the risks weren't universal. The same peppermint humbug that delighted a banker's son at a party might kill a laborer's daughter bought from a street cart. Candy revealed not only the appetite for pleasure, but the structural inequalities of Victorian life. In the end, the candy trade mirrored society itself. The wealthy enjoyed its luxuries in relative safety, while the poor bore the brunt of its dangers. Trust was a privilege the rich could buy, and the poor could only hope for. And when scandal erupted, the divide only widened. Moralists condemning the poor for reckless indulgence while quietly enjoying their imported chocolates. So yes, if you could afford a chef, your candy sparkled. If you couldn't, your candy sparked, and sometimes exploded into tragedy. The sweet tooth may have been universal, but the risks were anything but. When Victorian families began falling sick from poisoned bread, beer, or candy, they might reasonably have expected the government to leap into action. Surely someone in power would step in and declare, "Stop poisoning the nation's children." But the truth is less heroic. For much of the 19th century, government response to food adulteration ranged from indifference to denial. Regulation was basically one guy waving and saying, "Try not to die out there." Why the indifference? A big part of the answer lies in Britain's devotion to laissez-faire economics. The dominant belief was that the market could sort itself out without meddling from Parliament. If a vendor sold adulterated sweets, word would spread, customers would stop buying, and the vendor would either clean up their act or go out of business. It was the ultimate in self-policing, except that in practice it meant people had to die before change occurred. To lawmakers steeped in laissez-faire philosophy, the suffering of a few consumers was unfortunate, but not a reason to interfere with the sacred mechanics of trade. Another reason was class politics. Most victims of adulterated food were poor, and the poor rarely had the political clout to make Parliament listen. Middle and upper-class households often had safer suppliers, so adulteration didn't hit them as hard. When scandals erupted, the deaths of working-class children were often dismissed as tragic accidents rather than signs of systemic rot. Lawmakers, insulated by privilege, could sympathize at arm's length without feeling urgent pressure to act. There was also a lack of scientific consensus in the early years. Toxicology was still developing, and while chemists could sometimes prove the presence of adulterants, many politicians argued the evidence wasn't reliable enough to justify sweeping reforms. To skeptics, claims about poisoned bread or arsenic candy sounded alarmist, perhaps exaggerated by journalists hungry for scandal. It was easier to shrug and say, "It's probably not that bad," than to confront the ugly truth. Even when officials acknowledged adulteration, they often downplayed it as customary practice. Stretching flour with alum, watering down milk, or bulking candy with fillers was seen as simply how business was done. To outlaw these practices, critics argued, would cripple small tradesmen and raise food prices for the poor. The irony was cruel. The very measures meant to keep food affordable were also what made it dangerous, yet to lawmakers, poisoned candy was a tolerable side effect of cheapness. Early attempts at oversight were laughably weak. Local inspectors might occasionally test samples of food, but enforcement was rare and punishments were trivial. Vendors caught selling tainted goods were often fined small amounts, less than they made from a single day's sales. Some even treated fines as a cost of doing business, shrugging them off and continuing their practices. Imagine getting a £2 penalty for selling poison and thinking, well, I'll just sell more humbugs tomorrow to cover it. Government debates about adulteration often revealed just how indifferent authorities were. Some MPs argued that since Britain was prospering industrially, the dangers of adulterated food were a small price to pay for progress. Others insisted it was the consumer's responsibility to be vigilant, though how a poor mother was supposed to chemically test a loaf of bread before feeding her children was left unexplained. A few even defended adulteration outright, claiming it made food more durable or more attractive. In other words, poison was rebranded as innovation. Public health reformers tried to push back, but they faced resistance at every turn. When chemist Arthur Hill Hassell published damning studies in the 1850s showing widespread adulteration, officials dismissed his findings as exaggerated. His work revealed that nearly everything from coffee to candy contained contaminants, yet Parliament was slow to act. Why? Because to regulate meant to admit the free market wasn't perfect, and that was political heresy. The government's indifference was also reinforced by bureaucracy. Even when laws were proposed, they were watered down by endless committees, loopholes, and delays. Inspectors were underfunded, magistrates were lenient, and prosecutions were rare. For every tragedy like the Bradford humbug disaster that briefly forced attention, there were dozens of smaller poisonings ignored as background noise. The cruel reality was that Victorian society accepted a certain level of casualties as the cost of doing business. Deaths from adulterated candy weren't seen as preventable tragedies. They were brushed aside as inevitable misfortunes, like a factory accident or a cholera outbreak. Governments only acted when scandals became too large to ignore, when newspapers screamed and public outrage threatened stability. Until then, poisoned candy was filed under regrettable but not my problem. In hindsight, the government's indifference looks callous, even monstrous, but it made sense within the logic of the time. Industrial growth was prized above all, and protecting consumers was seen as interfering with progress. The dead were collateral damage in Britain's march toward modernity. Still, that indifference couldn't last forever. As scandals multiplied and reformers kept shouting, the cracks in laissez-faire logic grew harder to paper over. Eventually, even Parliament had to admit that letting children die from humbugs was bad for business. But in the early days, regulation was barely more than a polite suggestion, and one that many vendors ignored. So yes, regulation in the first half of the century was basically a single official waving vaguely in the direction of the marketplace and saying, "Try not to die out there." For countless families, that wave was the only protection they ever got. For every indifferent politician shrugging over poisoned humbugs, there were reformers who refused to let children die for the sake of cheap sugar. These early activists were the stubborn gadflies of Victorian society, chemists, doctors, journalists, and crusaders who believed food shouldn't double as a death sentence. They were the Victorian version of the organic kale movement, except they actually saved lives. One of the loudest voices belonged to Arthur Hill Hassell, a doctor and chemist whose career became a crusade against food adulteration. In the 1850s, Hassell began systematically testing everyday food and drink. He used a microscope to analyze samples of bread, coffee, beer, and yes, candy. What he found was horrifying: alum in bread, chicory and dirt in coffee, cocculus indicus in beer, and lead-based dyes in sweets. His reports read like autopsy notes for the Victorian diet. When he published his findings in The Lancet, the medical journal didn't just raise eyebrows, it raised panic. For the first time, the public had scientific evidence that their meals were more chemical experiment than nourishment. Hassell didn't just expose adulteration, he named and shamed. He published lists of vendors whose products tested positive for dangerous substances, effectively dragging them into the spotlight of public opinion. In an era when reputation meant everything, this was a devastating tactic. Shopkeepers and manufacturers howled in protest, but Hassal's work made it clear food fraud wasn't an occasional mishap, it was a systemic plague. But Hassall wasn't alone. Public health reformers like Thomas Wackley, editor of The Lancet, amplified the cause, using their platforms to demand legislative action. Wackley and Hassall became a tag team of outrage, one providing the damning data, the other broadcasting it to as wide an audience as possible. Together they transformed food adulteration from an unfortunate reality into a public scandal that could no longer be ignored. Meanwhile, local activists added fuel to the fire. In industrial towns like Manchester, Leeds and Bradford, civic leaders began documenting poisonings and lobbying for inspections. Clergymen thundered from pulpits about the sin of poisoning children, framing adulteration not just as a health issue but as a moral failing. Religious reformers argued that candy poisonings were evidence of unchecked greed, a society that put profit above life. This moral language resonated in a country still steeped in Christian duty, giving the campaign an ethical force beyond mere science. There were also journalists who smelled opportunity and maybe arsenic. Newspapers realized that exposing poisoned food sold papers almost as effectively as the poison itself sold funerals. Investigative pieces on adulterated sweets mixed outrage with horror, painting reformers as heroes battling shadowy villains in aprons. These stories made food safety a topic of drawing room conversation, ensuring the wealthy could no longer dismiss it as a poor man's problem. What made these campaigners remarkable was their persistence. For decades, officials brushed them off, claiming adulteration was exaggerated or unavoidable. Reformers responded with more tests, more reports, and more public pressure. They organized lectures, wrote pamphlets, and pestered Parliament with petitions. Slowly, their evidence built a wall too high to climb over and too solid to knock down. Of course, campaigners faced fierce resistance. Confectioners and food manufacturers accused them of fear-mongering, threatening livelihoods, and undermining trust in British trade. Some tried to discredit Hassall's science, while others lobbied Parliament to stall new laws. Reformers were painted as joyless meddlers, the sort of people who would snatch a toffee from a child's hand and replace it with a boiled turnip. But while their enemies mocked, children kept dying, and the public slowly realized the meddlers might actually have a point. The movement gained momentum in the 1860s and 1870s, when public health associations joined the fight. These organizations framed adulteration not just as a consumer issue, but as a national crisis. How could Britain pride itself on empire, industry and progress if its own citizens were being poisoned by their breakfasts and bonbons? Campaigners used patriotism as a lever. Safe food wasn't just about health, it was about national pride and strength. The campaigners' persistence eventually forced the government's hand. Their work laid the groundwork for landmark legislation like the Adulteration of Food and Drink Act 1860, and later the more robust Sale of Food and Drugs Act 1875. While these laws weren't perfect, they marked the first time Britain officially admitted that letting people die from humbugs wasn't just business as usual. Inspectors were appointed, fines grew harsher, and vendors could no longer hide behind excuses quite so easily. Perhaps most importantly, the campaigners shifted public opinion. Before their efforts, poison candy was shrugged off as bad luck. Afterward, it was seen as an outrage, a betrayal, a problem that demanded solutions. By linking science, morality, and public outrage, reformers changed how Victorians thought about food itself. In hindsight, it's astonishing how much these early campaigners accomplished with so little. Armed with microscopes, pamphlets, and stubbornness, they dragged food safety into the national conversation. They weren't selling kale smoothies or gluten-free brownies. They were trying to make sure your peppermint drop didn't double as rat poison. And in that mission, they actually saved lives. By the middle of the 19th century, Britain had endured enough tales of poisoned lozenges, chalky bread, and arsenic-colored sweets to realize that maybe, just maybe, the free market wasn't regulating itself quite so well. Reformers like Arthur Hill Hassall had been shouting from their microscopes, newspapers were filling columns with horror stories, and grieving families were demanding answers. Finally, Parliament stirred. The result was the Adulteration of Food and Drink Act of 1860, the nation's first attempt to say, in legal terms, that candy should be sweet, not lethal. On paper, the act was groundbreaking. For the first time, the government officially acknowledged that adulteration wasn't just a quirky side effect of industrialization, it was a public health menace. The law made it an offense to sell food or drink that had been knowingly mixed with any ingredient to the prejudice of the purchaser. In simpler terms, if you dumped chalk into flour or slipped arsenic into candy, you were breaking the law. For consumers who had long been told to just shop smarter, this was a revolutionary shift. But there were cracks in the sugar shell from the start. The 1860 Act was what historians often call a law with no teeth. It set rules but provided almost no real means of enforcement. Local authorities weren't required to appoint inspectors or chemists, and many simply didn't bother. There was no central agency to oversee compliance, no mandatory testing, and no consistent punishments. In practice, catching a dishonest sweet maker was still about as likely as finding a peppermint that hadn't been bulked with plaster. One problem was that the act relied on victims to bring forward complaints. Imagine a poor mother whose child had just died after eating a tainted humbug. Was she really going to scrape together the money to hire a lawyer and prosecute the local vendor? Even if she did, the case was hard to prove. Adulteration wasn't always visible, and chemists who could test for it were expensive. As a result, the law's impact was minimal. Many vendors carried on as before, confident that nothing short of mass poisoning would bring consequences. Still, the symbolism mattered. The act marked the first time Parliament formally stepped into the kitchen, the bakery, and the sweet shop to declare that food safety was a legitimate public concern. It was a crack in the armor of laissez-faire ideology. For reformers, it was proof that their years of campaigning hadn't been in vain. And for vendors, it was a warning shot across the counter. People were watching. The debates around the 1860 Act also revealed how far society had come, or hadn't. Critics of the law argued it would unfairly burden small tradesmen. Why, they asked, should the local sweet maker face prosecution when adulteration was customary across the industry? Supporters countered that custom was precisely the problem. Tradition was no excuse for murder by humbug. The fact that these arguments had to be made at all shows how normalized adulteration had become. When prosecutions did occur under the new law, they were often inconsistent. Some shopkeepers faced fines, while others escaped with warnings. Magistrates were reluctant to hand down harsh punishments, especially when defendants argued ignorance. "I didn't know the filler was plaster," or "my supplier assured me this green dye was safe." Courts frequently sympathized with struggling tradesmen, portraying them as victims of a confusing system rather than perpetrators of fraud. Nevertheless, the Act created a framework reformers could build upon. By establishing adulteration as a legal wrong, it set the stage for stronger laws in the decades that followed. The public, too, grew more vocal. Once a law existed, people had grounds to demand enforcement. The very existence of the 1860 Act gave citizens language to protest. They could now say vendors weren't just careless, they were breaking the law. Another subtle impact was educational. The Act forced people to start thinking about what was in their food. Discussions about pure versus adulterated products entered mainstream conversation. Reformers held up the law as a badge of progress, while campaigners used its weaknesses to argue for more robust regulation. The law may have been flimsy, but it made food safety part of the national dialogue. In hindsight, the 1860 Act was less a solution and more a starting line. It was the first domino in a chain that would eventually lead to stricter legislation, better inspections, and the slow taming of the candy trade. Critics at the time called it toothless, and they weren't wrong. But even a toothless law can bite if enough people push it forward. So while the Act didn't suddenly transform Victorian sweets into paragons of purity, it did something just as important. It planted the idea that food safety wasn't optional, and that the state had a role to play in protecting citizens. The first step towards safe humbugs was admitting humbugs could be unsafe. Finally, a law that said candy should be sweet, not lethal. It wasn't perfect, but it was a beginning, and in Victorian Britain, beginnings were rare enough to savour, preferably with something that didn't contain arsenic. When the Adulteration of Food and Drink Act of 1860 became law, reformers celebrated as though arsenic itself had been banished from the marketplace. Surely now, humbugs would be harmless, lozenges pure, and penny sweets safe for grubby little hands. But reality was more stubborn. Just because it was illegal didn't mean it was gone, much like your cousin's Wi-Fi password sharing. The problem was enforcement, or more accurately, the lack of it. Passing a law was one thing, paying for inspectors to march into sweet shops and test their wares was another. Many local authorities saw food safety inspections as an expensive luxury. Why invest in chemists and laboratories when potholes needed fixing and rates needed collecting? As a result, whole regions of Britain carried on much as before. Their candy still bulked with plaster or tinted with copper green, law or no law. Even where inspectors were appointed, prosecutions were tricky. Vendors could plead ignorance. I didn't know my filler was brick dust, or my supplier swore this green dye was perfectly safe. Courts often sympathized, handing out small fines or dismissing cases altogether. Magistrates didn't want to ruin the livelihoods of small shopkeepers, especially when poisoning was framed as an accident rather than a crime. For the unlucky customers, that distinction was cold comfort. The continuing danger was clear from medical reports and newspapers. Throughout the 1860s and 1870s, new cases of poisoned candy surfaced, though often on a smaller scale than disasters like Bradford. Children sickened at fairs, families fell ill after market day purchases, and coroners still recorded deaths from adulterated sweets. Each new story sparked another round of outrage, followed by the same weary sigh. Progress was happening, but glacially. Part of the problem was cultural. Consumers still demanded cheap candy, and vendors still felt pressure to meet that demand. The economics hadn't changed. A poor child with a penny wasn't shopping for pure, organic, artisanal sweets. They wanted as much sugar as that coin could buy, and if that meant the candy was cut with fillers, so be it. Vendors who tried to offer higher quality goods at higher prices often lost customers to competitors who kept costs down with a little creative chemistry. And then there were the dyes. Color was everything in the candy trade. Bright reds, yellows, and greens were irresistible to children. Yet safe synthetic dyes were not widely available until the later 19th century. Confectioners continued to rely on substances like copper sulfate, lead chromate, or vermilion, all of which carried risks. The law technically forbade selling food injurious to health, but unless someone actually collapsed, the candy passed without question. Another factor was inconsistency. Some towns invested in public health campaigns, hiring inspectors, and publicizing prosecutions. Others turned a blind eye. A child in Manchester might face stricter protections than a child in rural Cornwall. Not because of different laws, but because of different priorities. The patchwork enforcement meant that danger depended on geography as much as on appetite. Reformers were frustrated. Men like Arthur Hill Hassell kept insisting that partial measures weren't enough. Without mandatory inspections and uniform standards, adulteration would remain endemic. The government did eventually strengthen the law, most notably with the Sale of Food and Drugs Act of 1875. But in the meantime, the gap between promise and practice left consumers exposed. For families, the persistence of poisoned sweets meant living with a permanent background hum of risk. Parents scolded children not to buy candy from shady vendors, though what counted as shady was subjective. Some avoided brightly colored sweets, suspecting dyes. Others trusted long-standing vendors, hoping loyalty guaranteed safety. But ultimately, consumers had little power to control what went into their candy. Every purchase was still a gamble. Slow change also meant slow healing of public trust. Even as laws improved, suspicion lingered. Tales of poisoned humbugs were told long after the events themselves, passed down as cautionary folklore. Candy vendors had to work harder to reassure customers, emphasizing cleanliness and respectability in their shops. Middle-class families increasingly favored packaged sweets from reputable confectioners, widening the gap between classes once again. The poor still relied on street candy, and they still bore the brunt of the risk. It's easy, from a modern perspective, to wonder why Victorians tolerated this. But remember, danger was already everywhere. Food, water, workplaces, and even medicine were riddled with hazards. Candy was just one more risk in a world where death came from cholera outbreaks, collapsing buildings and runaway horses. Laws were progress, yes, but nobody expected them to transform daily life overnight. In the long arc of history, the 1860s and 1870s were decades of slow, uneven improvement. Candy poisonings became less frequent, but they didn't disappear. Reformers kept campaigning, newspapers kept reporting, and families kept fretting. The sweet tooth endured, but it endured with caution, shadowed by the memory of arsenic and plaster. So yes, Britain had laws on the books, but the marketplace didn't suddenly turn pure. Instead, progress dripped into the system as slowly as trickle, while dangers lingered like a stubborn aftertaste. Candy might eventually become safe, but in the meantime, every humbug still carried the faint echo of a dare. Do you feel lucky, sweet tooth? In the Victorian era, candy wasn't just a treat, it was a trust exercise. Every time you handed over a penny for a humbug, you were trusting that the vendor hadn't accidentally or deliberately turned it into a chemistry experiment. After decades of poisonings, scandals, and excuses, that trust took a beating. The legacy of the poison candy craze wasn't only a few infamous deaths, it was a shift in how people thought about food itself. Victorians taught us the golden rule: if it glows, don't eat it. For the working poor, the lesson was learned the hard way. Penny candy had once been an innocent indulgence, a cheap burst of colour and flavour in an otherwise grey existence. But after the Bradford disaster and countless smaller poisonings, parents eyed candy carts with suspicion. Mothers told children not to buy sweets from strange vendors, though what counted as strange was debatable. Everyone looked a little strange when they were selling neon green lozenges out of a cracked jar. Children, of course, didn't always listen, but the caution filtered into family life. Candy was no longer automatically a symbol of joy, it was a gamble. For the middle and upper classes, the lesson was different. They shifted their trust upward, toward established shops, branded goods, and recognizable packaging. Instead of penny candy from street stalls, they bought chocolates from names that promised refinement and safety. Companies like Fry's and Cadbury, which emphasized cleanliness and reputation, thrived in part because they offered something penny vendors couldn't: reassurance. Their chocolates came wrapped, boxed, and stamped with logos. That logo was more than decoration, it was a guarantee. It said, "We are not humbug, Billy." This shift toward branded goods marked a turning point in consumer culture. Before, shoppers relied on personal relationships, buying bread from a trusted baker, milk from a known dairyman, candy from the stallholder they'd seen for years. After repeated betrayals, trust migrated from people to packaging. The poison candy craze helped teach Victorians that if they wanted safety, they needed traceability. Who made it? Where did it come from? Was the company big enough to risk scandal if something went wrong? These questions became part of the shopping experience. Street vendors paid the highest price in terms of reputation. They had once been the heart of penny candy culture, their cries filling the markets and alleyways. But after poisonings, many customers, especially from rising middle classes, turned away from them. Penny candy became associated with risk, poverty, and danger. Even when laws improved, the stigma stuck. To eat street sweets was to admit you couldn't afford better, and to risk your health in the process. The distrust spread beyond candy. The wider food trade was infected with suspicion. Milk, bread, and beer were already known to be tampered with, and candy scandals reinforced the idea that nothing on the table was safe without oversight. Consumer skepticism became an ingrained habit. People sniffed bread, eyed milk, and hesitated before handing coins to vendors. This new culture of doubt wasn't all bad. It created momentum for reform and eventually laid the groundwork for consumer protection movements in the 20th century. At the same time, candy remained irresistible. Children nagged, parents relented, and vendors kept selling. But the shadow of poison never fully disappeared. Tales of glowing sweets, arsenic dyes, and plaster fillers circulated in households long after the worst poisonings subsided. They became cautionary tales, part of oral tradition. Don't eat anything too bright wasn't just parental fussiness. It was a survival strategy. Interestingly, the craze also shaped the marketing of sweets. By the late 19th century, confectioners began emphasizing purity and quality in their advertisements. Words like wholesome, untainted, and guaranteed popped up in ads alongside luscious illustrations of chocolates and bonbons. The subtext was clear: you can trust us, we're not going to kill you. Brands competed not only on flavor and price but on safety. The legacy extended well into modern consumer psychology. Even today, people are more suspicious of cheap, unbranded candy than of glossy packaged chocolates. The preference for sealed, branded goods over loose bulk sweets can be traced back to these Victorian scares. Poison Candy Craze didn't just kill trust in vendors, it permanently altered the landscape of consumer habits. But perhaps the deepest impact was cultural. Victorians came to see indulgence itself as dangerous. Sweets symbolized temptation, greed, and risk, not just morally, as preachers had long argued, but physically. A moment of pleasure could lead to agony or death. That uneasy mix of desire and danger gave candy a strange power in the Victorian imagination. It was both delight and menace, sweetness with a hidden sting. So while laws eventually made candy safer, the scars lingered in public memory. Parents still warned their children, reformers still reminded voters, vendors still fought to regain trust. The penny sweet cart never fully recovered, and the chocolate bar became the future. The poison candy craze had taught Victorians something fundamental. Food wasn't just about flavor, it was about faith. And once broken, that faith could never be entirely restored. In the end, the legacy wasn't just skepticism toward candy, but toward all cheap food. If it looked too colorful, too cheap, or too good to be true, Victorians hesitated. That hesitation echoes even today in the way we eye suspiciously bright treats at fairs or avoid unwrapped candies from strangers. The Victorians learned the hard way. We just inherited the instinct. Victorians taught us the golden rule: if it glows, don't eat it. It may not be in the statute books, but it's written in history and in the long, uneasy relationship between consumers and their sweets. The story of Victorian poison candy reads like a dark fairy tale. Children lured by bright colors, adults tempted by cheap indulgence, and hidden poisons lurking in every sweet. But unlike fairy tales, this one wasn't solved by a prince or a wand. It was solved slowly, painfully, by science, outrage, and the realization that leaving food safety to chance was a terrible idea. So next time you complain your chocolate bar has palm oil, remember you're not crunching on brick dust. The biggest lesson is obvious. Food safety doesn't just happen. It isn't a natural feature of modern life. It was fought for, tested in laboratories, argued in Parliament, and demanded by grieving families who had buried children because a humbug carried more arsenic than sugar. Today we take for granted that a candy bar in a wrapper is safe to eat, but that sense of security rests on the bones of Victorian tragedies. Another lesson is about progress and compromise. Laws didn't arrive fully formed and perfect. The 1860 Act was weak, the 1875 Act stronger, and later reforms stronger still. Each step came because people refused to accept death as a routine byproduct of dessert. The poison candy craze shows us that reform is rarely a thunderclap, it's a drizzle, frustratingly slow but steady enough to eventually water the roots of change. There's also a lesson about trust. The Victorian sweet tooth was betrayed over and over again, and that betrayal changed consumer culture forever. It created the demand for packaging, branding, and traceability. It set the stage for Cadbury's clean factories, Fry's branded chocolate bars, and Rowntree's reputation for purity. Today, when you pick a Snickers over an unwrapped sweet from a stranger, you're echoing a decision made generations ago by parents who learned, through heartbreak, that trust had to be earned. And then there's the lesson about human resilience. Even in the worst of scandals, people didn't give up candy. They complained, they raged, they buried their dead, but they kept buying sweets. The craving for sugar was stronger than fear. Reformers may have fought to make candy safe, but it was consumer demand that ensured the candy industry survived at all. If Victorians were willing to risk arsenic for a peppermint, is it any wonder we're still hooked on sugar today? Of course, the story isn't just about the past. Modern food scares, from contaminated baby formula to horse meat scandals, show that vigilance never ends. The Victorians remind us that regulation isn't bureaucracy for its own sake. It's the difference between a harmless treat and a lethal one. Every time inspectors test a chocolate batch, every time labels list ingredients, every time a recall happens, it's a small victory born of bitter history. The poison candy craze also leaves us with an uncomfortable mirror. Victorians tolerated risk because they had little choice. We, too, sometimes accept questionable food practices for the sake of price or convenience. Palm oil, corn syrup, preservatives, they may not be arsenic, but they raise their own debates about health, ethics, and sustainability. The difference is that our chocolate bars won't kill us overnight. Progress doesn't mean perfection, but compared to arsenic humbugs, it feels like a sweet deal. And perhaps the strangest lesson of all is about memory. The candy poisonings of the 19th century echo faintly today in urban legends about razor blades in Halloween apples or poisoned sweets handed out by strangers. These stories endure because the Victorian reality was so shocking that it burned itself into cultural memory. Modern myths may be exaggerated, but they have roots in very real tragedies. So what does this all say about progress? It says that every time you bite into a chocolate bar without fear, you're tasting history. It says that the humblest reforms, testing a sweet, enforcing a fine, writing a law, can ripple across generations. It says that even in the most frivolous of industries, lives are at stake, and the line between indulgence and catastrophe is thinner than a sugar shell. The Victorians turned candy into a cautionary tale, and we are the beneficiaries. Thanks to their suffering, our treats are safer, our trust stronger, and our chocolate bars blissfully free of arsenic green. So the next time you peel back a wrapper, savor not just the sweetness but the history. Because once upon a time, a peppermint humbug could kill you, and today, it just makes your dentist rich.